They wore crowns, but behind the palace doors, they broke every rule. For 1,000 years, England's royals have hidden their most dangerous secrets in velvet-lined silence, until now. This isn't a fairy tale. It's 30 chapters of obsession, betrayal, forbidden desire, and power gone sideways. Kings undone by scandal, queens rewritten by rumor, and heirs who never made it to the throne. You've heard the official version. This is what they didn't teach you in history class. Welcome to the 30 most perverted English royals in history. And no, it doesn't get more respectable from here. Before we peel back the velvet curtain, make sure you're part of the circle. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you deep into a midnight rabbit hole in Toronto? Hiding your earbuds in class in Melbourne? We want to know who's out there listening in the dark. Now, take a breath. Because once we start, there's no unhearing what these royals did behind closed doors. 1. William II. Rufus. If a king falls in a forest and no one mourns, did he ever really rule? William II of England, known less formally and far more damningly as William Rufus, was the kind of monarch who left behind a legacy not of policy or conquest, but of rumor, insinuation, and one of the most poetically convenient deaths in medieval royal history. The year was 1100. The king went out hunting in the New Forest. An arrow pierced his chest. His body was left behind by his companions, who all agreed, without speaking, that it was a very good day to suddenly forget protocol and disappear into the woods. The arrow came from the bow of Walter Tyrrell, supposedly a friend. But it was the church that fired the real shot, long after William was dead. They painted him not merely as a tyrant, but as something more insidious, unnatural, unchaste, effeminate. The words they chose were deliberate, moralistic, and purposefully vague. They didn't accuse him of specific acts. They didn't need to. The stain of sodomy was broad enough to cover anything they disliked. William Rufus never married. He never produced heirs. He filled his court with young men, dressed in the latest fashions of the time, which meant silks, pointed shoes, and a surplus of perfume. His court, according to monastic chroniclers, reeked of vice. Or to be precise, effeminacy, a term medieval writers weaponized like a club. It didn't describe gender expression. It was code for moral collapse, spiritual infection, a creeping contagion of indulgence that threatened to rot the kingdom from within. It was a convenient diagnosis. William had spent most of his reign treating the church as a mildly irritating rival, not a spiritual authority. He refused to fill ecclesiastical vacancies so he could hoard the income. He left the Archbishop of Canterbury's seat empty for years, deliberately. He taxed clergy, mocked their processions, and seemed to take a sincere, unregulated joy in reminding the pious that they were not in charge. Naturally, the church responded in the only way it knew how. It turned his reputation into a slow-burning bonfire. Sodomy, after all, was the kind of sin that didn't require proof. Just whispers. Just enough aesthetic deviation. Enough moral distance from the norm. If you didn't marry and surrounded yourself with young, beautiful men and didn't seem to enjoy sermons, well, that was more than enough for the scribes. They didn't need eyewitnesses. They had metaphors. Modern scholars point out, often with academic sighs, that the medieval label of sodomy was as much about social disorder as about sex. It could include anything from corruption to heresy to an unwholesome fondness for French wine. But in William's case, it stuck. Because it helped explain everything else about him. His arrogance, his irreverence, his failure to continue the bloodline, and above all, his resistance to holy authority. In this sense, his death was his perfect. The forests of England were not just wooded landscapes. They were symbols of wildness, of the ungoverned. William died there, alone, abandoned, pierced by a hunting arrow no one bothered to trace. Walter Tyrrell insisted it was an accident. Everyone else found that deeply convenient. The king's corpse was carted to Winchester in a peasant's cart, bleeding into the planks. No royal procession, no divine omen. Just an arrow, a body, and the silent satisfaction of monks. Chroniclers quickly declared his death was God's justice. The earth, they said, rejected him. His blood defiled the ground. His spirit was cast out. The rhetoric was total. This was not a monarch who had simply died. This was a moral parable aimed at future rulers, a warning in flesh. And yet, there's something suspiciously tidy about the whole thing, isn't there? A king without heirs, a rival brother conveniently nearby, Henry, who would ascend within hours, a death in the woods witnessed only by men who fled, a body unclaimed for hours. And then, of course, the church's perfect post-mortem victory lap. Which brings us back to the central question. What exactly was William Rufus guilty of? Being unmarried? Perhaps. That was enough to raise eyebrows. Favoring handsome young men? Suspicious. Enjoying courtly pageantry and refusing the church its dues? Practically a confession. Or maybe, just maybe, he was guilty of being inconvenient. His lifestyle, his policies, his very existence, unfit for sainthood, but also unfit for the simple villain role. So they turned him into a symbol, a warning, a scandal soaked in implication. His sexuality, whatever it actually was, became political currency. The lack of a queen, the decorative court, the perfume, the silks, the pointed shoes, all stacked like kindling under a verdict nobody could quite prove but everyone felt very comfortable repeating. Centuries later, historians continue to debate the specifics. Was William gay? Was he celibate? Was he merely indifferent to the entire reproductive agenda of monarchy? Was his real crime against the church, not against nature? None of these questions have satisfying answers, which makes him perfect for our purposes. Because William Rufus was less a person than a prism, a way to reflect the moral fears of his age, sexual, religious, dynastic, and twist them into a narrative of deserved death. A target so riddled with metaphor that even his body, dumped unceremoniously in a cathedral, seemed to ask, "Are you sure you want the truth? Or are you just here for a good explanation?" And if that's unsettling, wait until you meet his brother. 2. Henry I, King of England. If William Rufus was accused of loving too little in the correct way, his younger brother Henry was accused of loving far too much and far too widely. Henry I ascended the throne with the speed of a man who had rehearsed the moment. While his brother lay cooling in the New Forest, Henry rode hard for Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and declared himself king before anyone had time to ask uncomfortable questions about arrows, witnesses, or abandoned corpses. History would later debate William's morality. Henry had no intention of leaving room for debate about his legitimacy. He married quickly. He crowned himself decisively. And then, quietly, he began leaving a trail of children across England that no one could possibly ignore. Henry I had more acknowledged illegitimate children than any English monarch before or since. Not rumors. Not whispered accusations, names, records, marriages arranged for them, lands granted, church posts secured. The king didn't deny them, he curated them. By medieval standards, kings were not expected to be monogamous saints. Discretion, however, was a requirement. Henry ignored that rule entirely. His private life spilled into public administration with the confidence of a man who believed the rules were for other people. His mistresses came from noble families, court circles, and politically sensitive households. His children were raised openly, educated carefully, and inserted into the machinery of power. This wasn't indulgence, it was policy. Chroniclers struggled to describe it. Moralists complained, but often quietly. Henry was competent, brutally competent. He restored order after his brother's chaos, tightened royal justice, and stabilized the realm. As long as England functioned, many were willing to avert their eyes from the king's bedroom. until the bedroom started producing political consequences. The problem wasn't sin, it was mathematics. Henry's legitimate marriage to Matilda of Scotland produced heirs, but fate was uncooperative. When his only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, the kingdom collectively inhaled and realized something terrifying. The throne was now surrounded by Henry's many other children, all half-royal, all connected to powerful families, all technically excluded, and all politically useful. Illegitimacy in medieval England wasn't just a moral label, it was a legal one. It meant exclusion from inheritance, but not exclusion from influence. And Henry had scattered influence everywhere. Some of his illegitimate daughters were married into key noble houses, binding the aristocracy to the crown in ways that bypassed traditional succession rules. Sons were placed in church offices, castles, and command roles. These children became instruments, anchors tying the realm together through blood that counted just enough to matter, but not enough to rule. At least, that was the plan. Church writers were uneasy. Not because Henry was uniquely immoral, but because he was openly so, and because he showed no interest in repentance theater. He didn't make public displays of remorse. He didn't frame his conduct as weakness. His relationships were not treated as temptations. They were treated as facts. The king did not apologize for being prolific. He organized it. This made him dangerous. Unlike his brother, Henry didn't provoke clerical outrage through mockery or aesthetic rebellion. He was careful, literate, politically astute. His scandal wasn't flamboyant, it was structural. It threatened to blur the lines that kept inheritance, legitimacy, and divine order neatly aligned. A king who could create dozens of semi-royal figures without consequence was a king who made the entire system look optional. And yet, Henry's contemporaries largely tolerated it. Why? Because he ruled well. Justice was enforced. Coinage stabilized. Rebellions were crushed efficiently. The kingdom functioned. Moral discomfort was quietly filed away under acceptable compromise. As long as Henry lived, his personal excesses were manageable. But kingdoms do not end when kings die. They unravel afterward. Henry's solution to the succession crisis was bold, unprecedented, and deeply unsettling to many. He named his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his heir. He forced the nobility to swear loyalty to her, again and again. On paper, this should have settled the matter. In reality, it did the opposite. Henry's reign had trained England to accept ambiguity. Illegitimate children with power. Bloodlines that mattered and didn't matter simultaneously. Authority enforced by competence rather than tradition. When Henry died in 1135, the kingdom was left with a question it no longer knew how to answer cleanly. What exactly makes a ruler legitimate? The answer came swiftly and violently. Stephen of Blois seized the throne. Civil war followed. The period known as the Anarchy tore England apart. And beneath the surface of the conflict, beneath castles changing hands and oaths being broken, lingered Henry's shadow. His personal life, once tolerated as a private indulgence, now looked like a warning label everyone had ignored. His illegitimate children didn't cause the war, but they were symptoms of a deeper issue, a monarchy that had stretched the boundaries of inheritance, loyalty, and moral authority until they snapped back unpredictably. In retrospect, Henry's sexuality and relationships weren't scandalous because they were excessive. They were scandalous because they were unapologetically integrated into governance. He treated intimacy as a political resource. And politics eventually returned the favor, with interest. Later chroniclers softened their tone. Compared to Rufus, Henry looked respectable. He attended church. He married. He ruled wisely. But the numbers remained. The genealogies couldn't be erased. The whispers lingered, not of depravity, but of overreach. Henry V proved something profoundly uncomfortable for medieval England, that a king could be both morally suspect and administratively brilliant, that private conduct didn't always doom public success. and that the consequences of personal choices might take decades to surface, long after the man himself was safely buried. His reign ended quietly. His legacy did not. And looming over that legacy was a woman who had watched, learned, ruled, and been judged far more harshly than any man. One whose independence would be repackaged by enemies as scandal, seduction, and dangerous autonomy. Because if Henry taught England to tolerate excess, Eleanor of Aquitaine would teach it how much that tolerance terrified them. If you're still here after that, a journey through political bedchambers and medieval moral crises, then you clearly belong here. So before we dive headfirst into the next royal entanglement, take a second to officially join the strange, velvet-curtained chaos. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know down in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? We're building a global circle of night owls, history nerds, and scandal enthusiasts. You're in good company. Now, back to the next royal whose personal life could have toppled a kingdom. 3. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of England. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't need to misbehave to become scandalous. She only needed to exist loudly. Born into one of the most powerful inheritances in Europe, Eleanor arrived in history already breaking rules that had not yet been written down. She was wealthy in her own right, educated, politically fluent, and catastrophically unwilling to shrink herself to fit the expectations of medieval womanhood. That alone would have been enough to make her dangerous. Everything else simply gave her enemies better vocabulary. When Eleanor married Louis VII of France, she was still a teenager. The marriage was meant to be an alliance. Instead, it became a disappointment wrapped in theology. Louis was pious, hesitant, inward-looking. Eleanor was curious, sharp, socially magnetic. Chroniclers would later frame the mismatch as moral failure, hers. Not his inability to match her energy, but her refusal to be subdued. When their marriage collapsed and was annulled, rumors followed Eleanor like a second dowry. Whispers of inappropriate intimacy, accusations of loose conduct, none of them substantiated, all of them useful. In a world where women's authority was always suspect, sexual rumor was the most efficient solvent available. She remarried quickly, alarmingly quickly, to Henry Plantagenet, future Henry II of England. That speed alone unsettled observers. A powerful woman moving decisively was assumed to be hiding something. The logic was circular and airtight. A woman with influence must be immoral. Evidence of immorality proves she should not have influence. Eleanor became Queen of England and remained, inconveniently, herself. She traveled. She held court. She patronized poets. She advised. She disagreed. And most dangerously, she remembered that Aquitaine was hers, not her husband's. Hers. Medieval chroniclers struggled with this. When they couldn't criticize her governance directly, they criticized her virtue. When they couldn't find evidence, they implied appetite. The crusade provided fertile ground. Eleanor accompanied Louis VII on the Second Crusade, an act that was already scandalous by implication. Queens were symbols, not participants. Her presence, surrounded by noble women, became a magnet for rumor. Later writers claimed she behaved improperly, encouraged luxury, or disrupted discipline. Some suggested relationships that conveniently explained why the crusade failed. Because clearly, the collapse of a massive military religious campaign required a woman-shaped scapegoat. Modern historians note the pattern with weary familiarity. Eleanor's supposed sexual misconduct always coincided with moments where she exercised authority, visibility, or independence. The accusations were less about behavior and more about discomfort. A woman who could not be controlled had to be reframed as a woman who could not control herself. Her marriage to Henry II deteriorated spectacularly. They produced children. Many children. Kings, rebels, future legends. But partnership gave way to rivalry. Eleanor backed her sons during their revolts against Henry, an act that sealed her reputation as not just immoral, but dangerous. She was imprisoned for years, politically, not penitentially. Her confinement was about power, not propriety. And yet, the sexualized rumors never stopped. Chroniclers painted her as manipulative, excessive, indulgent. They hinted at impropriety with courtiers. They recycled older accusations. The goal was never truth. It was narrative control. If Eleanor could be remembered as licentious, her political agency could be dismissed as corruption rather than competence. After Henry's death, Eleanor emerged from captivity and ruled as Queen Mother with startling effectiveness. She negotiated ransoms, secured successions, managed crises. But memory is written by those who fear precedent. A woman who ruled too well had to be explained away, so the legends grew. She became a symbol of excess, of romantic danger, of female appetite masquerading as authority. Never mind that male rulers with mistresses were described as virile. Eleanor was described as destabilizing. The same actions filtered through a different body became a scandal. The irony is brutal. Eleanor's actual private life remains largely opaque. What survives is not evidence but accusation, not testimony but tone. Her sexuality became a canvas for other people's anxieties, about female power, inheritance, autonomy, and the frightening idea that leadership might not belong exclusively to men. She lived into old age. She outlived husbands, enemies, and most of her children. She died respected, feared, and still faintly scandalous. Not because of what she did in private, but because she refused to behave like a supporting character in someone else's reign. Eleanor's story teaches a crucial lesson for understanding royal perversion. Sometimes the scandal isn't excess. Sometimes it's independence. Sometimes the most unforgivable sin is competence without permission. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. Her legacy didn't end with her. Because one of her sons would inherit not just her intelligence and authority, but also the same cloud of sexual ambiguity, moral speculation, and rumor-driven judgment. A king who would become a legend for bravery, devotion, and absence, and whose private life would be dissected with the same suspicious hunger once reserved for his mother. History would call him Richard the Lionheart, and then quietly ask what kind of lion never comes home. 4. Richard, the Lionheart, King of England. Richard I was the kind of monarch history prefers in oil paintings and battlefield poems, muscles, banners, sunsets, the occasional eagle flying dramatically overhead. He was brave, he was bold, and according to most of his subjects, he was also missing. During his 10-year reign, Richard spent less than 6 months in England. He fought in the Holy Land. He got himself imprisoned in Austria. He negotiated with emperors, insulted kings, and occasionally remembered to send updates home. For a man crowned as the sovereign of England, he treated the place like a mildly interesting summer estate. Visited rarely, taxed often, and always held at emotional arm's length. And yet, for all his physical distance, Richard looms large in English legend. He's the king who wasn't there and somehow became synonymous with Englishness itself. Defender of the faith, crusader, saintly warrior, patron of the cross, the perfect Christian, knight, except of course for that uncomfortable footnote. The rumors. Richard's reign and his reputation have always carried with them a strange kind of tension, the gap between the holy warrior myth and the whispered suspicions that he might not have been quite so holy, or quite so straight. The accusations then and now are slippery. No one ever caught him. No one ever documented a smoking love letter or a compromising incident. What we have instead is that oldest of royal poisons, implication. Medieval chroniclers, especially those writing after his death, were fond of placing him in morally complex shadows. There are penitential tales, Richard confessing to sins of the flesh, including the ambiguous sodomy. There are records of unusually close male friendships described in terms that left just enough room for suspicion. And there's the noticeable lack of certain expected behaviors for a king of his era, namely, a queen producing heirs. Richard married Berengaria of Navarre. She was crowned Queen of England. She almost certainly never set foot in the country. Their union produced no children, and if you blink, you might miss her entirely in the historical record. Contemporary sources remark, rather diplomatically, that they spent little time together. Modern biographers are slightly less charitable, often noting that the marriage seemed more like a diplomatic checkbox than a relationship. But this, in itself, wasn't entirely shocking for the time. Royal marriages were rarely about affection, and heirs could be produced with other women if needed. Just ask Henry I. What made Richard's private life suspicious was not the lack of children, but the quality and intensity of his relationships with certain male courtiers. Foremost among them, Philip II of France. Richard and Philip had an unusually close relationship during the early Crusade years. They dined together. They campaigned together. They shared a bed, an arrangement that medieval chroniclers occasionally mention, often with a note of discomfort or coy ambiguity. It wasn't necessarily sexual. Shared beds were not uncommon among nobility. But the tone of some sources suggested that there was more than diplomacy at work. One 12th century chronicler noted that Richard and Philip loved each other so much that the King of England would daily eat and sleep in the same bed as the King of France. Again, this could be innocent. Or it could be political poetry masking something more. Later writers, especially in the Renaissance and beyond, would take these hints and run with them. Some described Richard as openly sodomitical. Others rejected the idea entirely, insisting that his penitential behavior later in life was proof of repentance rather than confirmation. The Church, ever ready to insert itself into historical memory, helped shape the narrative by recording Richard's acts of penance, often public and possibly performative. He did penance in Sicily, in Rome, after battles, before campaigns. It became part of his public routine: sin, confess, atone. But what was he confessing? His anger? His pride? His bloodshed? Or something else, less visible, more whispered? No one knows, and perhaps that's why the question still haunts his memory. Modern historians approach Richard with careful language. Some stress the vagueness of medieval sexual terminology, noting that sodomy could mean anything from actual sexual behavior to mere political favoritism. Others highlight the broader context, how male intimacy, when combined with power, could easily become suspect. In a court culture obsessed with masculinity, virtue, and legacy, any deviation from the expected norms became potential scandal. And then, of course, there's the strategic silence. Richard's court produced few open references to his private affections. There are no grand romantic letters, no detailed accusations, nothing that would satisfy modern curiosity. Instead, we get fragments, defensive chroniclers, disapproving monastics, odd silences, repeated penance, a queen who disappears, a reputation shaped less by what he did and more by what people feared he might have done. In death, Richard became more legend than man, the Lionheart, the Crusader king, defender of the realm. But underneath the metal and myth is a much quieter figure, unmarried, airless, emotionally distant, and persistently ambiguous. His sexuality remains a historical mystery not because of what we know, but because of what we can't stop speculating. Every silence in the record becomes a question mark. Every close male friendship becomes suspicious. Every absence becomes presence. And that absence matters. Because Richard's lack of an heir triggered more than just gossip. It set the stage for succession crises, rebellions, and a very familiar narrative. A king's private life turning into a public problem. His younger brother John inherited the throne. Where Richard was the absent saint, John was the present disgrace. And if the Lionheart was shadowed by rumors of who he loved, John would be damned for how he treated those who refused him. Because Richard left behind a throne, and John left behind claw marks. 5. King John, King of England. If Richard was the king whose mystery kept him just out of reach, John was the king whose sins practically kicked the palace doors open and dared history to look away. King John, of Magna Carta fame, Robin Hood villainy, and chronicler loathing, has the rare distinction of being universally disliked. His enemies loathed him. His allies distrusted him. The church excommunicated him. And when the barons finally rebelled, they made it a moral event. Not just political revolt, but divine correction. A national exorcism. Among the many charges laid at John's feet, tyranny, greed, cowardice, was a recurring and poisonous theme: sexual predation. The sources don't mince words, though they do cloak their accusations in the pious outrage of chroniclers. John, they said, was a ravisher of noblewomen, a defiler of brides, a king who treated aristocratic families as if they were part of his private inventory. When a noble married, he watched his back and his daughter's door. The king's attention was a liability. Medieval chronicles, especially those sympathetic to the barons, painted John as the very embodiment of misrule. He was greedy, yes, but worse, he was lascivious, not charming, not seductive, not even scandalous in the way kings were sometimes indulgently forgiven for being. John's interest in women was described as invasive, unrelenting, and, crucially, politically destabilizing. That last part is key. Medieval kings were expected to be above their vices. A mistress here or there was tolerable, especially if kept discreet. But John's behavior, at least as described by his critics, crossed a line. He didn't just indulge, he coerced. He didn't just pursue, he humiliated. The records suggest a pattern of behavior in which women were seen not as partners but as leverage, ways to pressure their families, manipulate noble loyalty, or punish defiance. Whether all these accounts are accurate is impossible to say. Chroniclers in the early 13th century were as political as they were religious. They wrote for patrons. They framed their narratives to justify rebellion. A hated king's moral failings became convenient ammunition. It's hard to separate reality from polemic, but even propaganda leaves fingerprints of truth. What we know for certain is this. By the early 1200s, John's reputation among the nobility had collapsed. Lords feared for their daughters, not just their lands. The perception was widespread that the king's interest in women was not romantic but strategic, that he used his power not merely to punish political enemies, but to shame their households. The term lechery appears again and again, not just as a moral insult, but as a weaponized label. To be ruled by John was not just dangerous, it was indecent, and it wasn't limited to noble women. Some accounts describe John taking women from any background he chose, wives of merchants, servants, widows. He had, in the words of one monk, no regard for law or station. In other words, he broke the unspoken social contract. The idea that kings, while powerful, must observe a minimum standard of restraint. John replaced restraint with appetite, preference with impulse. It's worth noting that the most famous political document in English history, the Magna Carta, contains a clause about royal marriage arrangements and widows' rights. Specifically, it forbids the king from forcing noblewomen to marry or remarry against their will. That clause didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was a direct response to the way John had wielded female autonomy as a political cudgel. Even his diplomatic behavior betrayed the same pattern. In a world where royal marriages were chess pieces, John had a habit of turning the board over. He famously snatched Isabel of Angoulême out from under the nose of a powerful local lord who was betrothed to her. The move was technically legal. John had power. But it created lasting resentment, triggered a rebellion, and poisoned his reputation further. Isabel was young, politically valuable, and suddenly queen. Her family's resentment helped push French barons into open opposition. Once again, John's pursuit of a woman had geopolitical consequences, and that, in the end, was his real sin. It wasn't that he was immoral, it was that his immorality was bad for business. Kings could sin, but only if they sinned safely. John's scandals weren't private embarrassments, they were public liabilities. They turned allies into enemies. They turned daughters into diplomatic flashpoints. They made every noblewoman's wedding a potential source of royal interference. And when the rebellion came, the sexual narrative followed close behind. The barons didn't just accuse him of unjust taxation or foreign mismanagement. They described a king who was morally unfit, who defiled the land and the people alike, who could not be trusted with power because he could not control himself. His body became an emblem of national corruption. His desires became metaphors for tyranny. After his death in 1216, England did not mourn. His body was buried in Worcester Cathedral with as much dignity as could be mustered, but the collective sigh of relief echoed louder than the funeral rites. Even his tomb, over the centuries, has been more studied than celebrated, a symbol not of reverence, but of warning. And in this sense, John's story fits neatly into the larger royal pattern. When private appetites threaten public order, the scandal becomes systemic. And when the church and nobility align in moral condemnation, a king's body becomes the battlefield. But if John's story is about aggressive excess, the next chapter in royal scandal turns inward. Because the line between favoritism and affection is always thin, and when a king's closest companion isn't a wife or a mistress, but a young male nobleman, the kingdom begins to whisper. What if the real threat isn't what the king takes, but who he chooses to give everything to? 6. Edward II, King of England. If King John made a mess of power by wielding it too aggressively, Edward II made an entirely different kind of mess by giving it away too intimately. Where John bulldozed over nobility with force and appetite, Edward chose favorites. And not just advisors or allies, but young men who, in the eyes of his court, looked suspiciously like lovers and acted dangerously like kings. He was the kind of monarch who baffled his barons, physically imposing but politically passive. Born into the shadow of a war-hardened father, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, he inherited not just a kingdom, but an impossible masculine ideal. His father had been all grit and conquest. Edward II preferred rowing boats, rustic hobbies, and private company with men no one at court could quite figure out how to talk about without lowering their voices. The name Piers Gaveston appears early and often in the story. Gaveston was a Gascon knight of minor nobility, brought into Edward's household in his youth. As the prince grew into adulthood, so did the bond. By the time Edward became king in 1307, Gaveston was more than a friend. He was a fixture, showered with titles, lands, and privileges that outraged the nobility. Gaveston wasn't just well treated. He was elevated to a level that many considered politically blasphemous. The barons protested. They issued formal complaints. They insisted that Gaveston was arrogant, flamboyant, and dangerously influential. What they really meant, of course, was that he was not one of them. He hadn't earned his place through blood or service. He'd earned it through intimacy, a closeness with the king that threatened to rewrite the rules of power. And then came the rumors. The language of the time rarely spoke plainly, but it didn't need to. Accusations of undue familiarity and corruption of the realm came with winks and raised eyebrows. Chroniclers leaned into innuendo. Churchmen cited moral decay. Political pamphlets didn't accuse Edward of love. They accused him of being unmanly. Sodomy, once again, became the all-purpose term for what couldn't be comfortably named. Modern historians still debate the nature of Edward's relationships. Was he gay by modern definitions? Bisexual? Emotionally dependent? It may be impossible to say. What matters more is how his court responded, with outrage, fear, and eventually rebellion. Edward married Isabella of France, a diplomatic union brokered to create peace between England and France. But the marriage began with a public insult. Gaveston was the true consort. He took precedence at court events. He received more lavish gifts. He walked beside the king as if the marriage were merely a political inconvenience. It didn't last. Political pressure mounted. The nobility forced Gaveston's exile, then his return, then exile again. Eventually, they had him hunted down and executed, without trial, and with full awareness of how deeply it would wound the king. It wasn't just a power play. It was a warning. Favoritism has limits. And Edward ignored it. Gaveston was replaced in time by the Despensers, Hugh the Younger and his father. The same pattern reemerged. Elevation, rewards, court dominance, and once again, suspicion. The Despensers were even more hated than Gaveston. Their rise was seen not as a restoration of order, but as the continuation of Edward's personal regime, a world in which emotional closeness to the king meant unchecked authority. This time, the consequences were greater. A baronial revolt erupted. Civil war followed. And while the Despensers became symbols of tyranny, Edward's own position grew weaker by the hour. His failure to lead, combined with his reliance on favorites, created a portrait of a king who could neither govern nor be governed. And then Isabella re-entered the story, not as a sidelined queen, but as a central figure in the coup that would topple her husband. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer, political, and perhaps more, became the foundation for Edward's deposition. When they returned from exile and raised an army, they did so with the language of national salvation. The king, they said, had allowed immoral men to corrupt the court. The realm had been led astray. The family had been dishonored. In 1327, Edward II became the first English monarch to be formally deposed by Parliament. The charges against him included not just misrule but giving himself up to improper pursuits and loving those who did not merit his regard. It wasn't just about failure, it was about intimacy. He was imprisoned. The Despensers were executed, graphically, publicly, and with ritualistic cruelty designed to cleanse the court. The message was clear. Kings who love unwisely are unfit to rule. Edward's death remains a mystery. The official story, death by illness, has never satisfied historians. Rumors of escape, assassination, or something worse have circled for centuries. But as with so much in his reign, the details are less important than the symbolism. He was a king undone not by enemies, but by affection. His sin, in the eyes of his contemporaries, wasn't war or greed or cruelty. It was emotional dependence on men who weren't supposed to matter. The scandal wasn't just personal, it was structural. Edward's intimacy disrupted the machinery of feudal politics. His favoritism created a vacuum where rule was supposed to be. And into that vacuum poured all the anxieties of a kingdom still unsure how to define power, masculinity, or loyalty. And yet, despite the accusations, despite the downfall, despite the rewritten chronicles and carefully worded condemnations, Edward II continues to haunt the narrative of monarchy, not as a cautionary tale about vice, but as a case study in what happens when emotional reality collides with public performance. Because if Edward blurred the line between affection and rule, the next scandalous royal would do something even more threatening. She would take the reins herself, and England would call it treason. 7. Isabella of France, Queen of England. Isabella of France did what most medieval queens were expected to do. She married strategically, bore children dutifully, and smiled at ceremonies arranged by people who did not consider her a political actor. Then she did something entirely unexpected. She overthrew her husband and ran the kingdom. The scandal began long before the swords came out. It started in silence, inside a court where Queen Isabella, daughter of the powerful Philip IV of France, watched her husband, Edward II, give his affection, wealth, and political authority to men who weren't her. Not advisors, not generals, not noblemen of the realm, favorites, chosen companions, Despensers, Gavestons. She had been married at 12, crowned before she had a real voice, and then sidelined while Edward played royal patron to the Despensers, especially Hugh the Younger, a man who occupied the role of queen more convincingly than Isabella was allowed to. Edward elevated Hugh not just financially but symbolically. He was given authority over royal households. Estates, gifts meant for the queen, found their way to the dispensers. And Isabella was expected to play the smiling spouse, all while her influence disappeared piece by piece. Isabella endured it at first. She played the diplomatic role. She was popular among the people and respected at foreign courts. But over time, the dispensers turned their attention directly on her. Her lands were seized. Her allies were purged. Even her children were used as bargaining chips in the paranoid chess game Edward played to secure his inner circle. At some point, Isabella stopped being a royal ornament and became something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing to lose. She left England under the pretext of a diplomatic mission to France. She negotiated treaties, smiled for ambassadors, and then she stopped responding to summons from her husband. She refused to return. She formed an alliance, personal, political, perhaps romantic, with Roger Mortimer, a powerful exile who shared her hatred of the dispensers. And in 1326, she returned to England not as a queen, but as an invader. Her army was small but symbolic. The nobility, sick of the dispenser regime, rallied to her. Cities opened their gates. The dispensers were captured. The younger one, Edward's beloved, was executed with dramatic flair, and Edward himself was deposed, a broken figure surrounded by enemies he hadn't realized he'd made. For the first time in English history, a reigning king was removed not just by nobles or parliament, but with the guiding hand of his own queen. This alone would have guaranteed Isabella a place in the annals of royal scandal. But it was what came next that turned her from political anomaly into moral threat. She ruled. Not in name, her son, Edward III, was crowned king. But Isabella and Mortimer controlled the regency, and for 4 years they governed the realm as co-rulers in everything but title. Taxes were levied, favors distributed, enemies punished. Mortimer took up residence in royal castles, issued proclamations, carried himself as a sovereign, and people noticed. Almost immediately, the language of sin returned. Chroniclers described Isabella's unnatural influence. Rumors spread about her relationship with Mortimer. Adultery, whispered the clerics. Treason, muttered the barons. But most damning of all was the sense that she had disrupted the moral order of the world. A woman was not supposed to dethrone a king. She was not supposed to govern. And she was certainly not supposed to replace a husband with a man of her own choosing. The scandal wasn't just about sex. It was about power. A queen acting like a king. A woman choosing her partner, her policy, her path. It made the establishment nervous. It made the church nervous. It made her own son nervous. In 1330, Edward III, barely 18, staged a palace coup. Mortimer was seized and executed. Isabella was placed under house arrest, gently, respectfully, but definitively. Her regency was over. Her name became a cautionary tale, and the chronicles, which had once praised her bravery, turned. Isabella became the she-wolf of France, a queen who had betrayed her husband, taken a lover, and ruled as if the crown belonged to her. The legend overwrote the details. The nuance of rebellion, governance, political necessity, all erased under the moral simplicity of female ambition framed as sexual betrayal. And yet, the records tell a different story. They show a woman who watched her position shrink for years before she fought back, who raised armies not for lust, but for survival, who governed England in a moment of crisis and brought temporary stability to a fractured realm, who was punished not for crimes, but for success. Her supposed affair with Mortimer, even if real, was never the source of her downfall. It was the justification. A woman with power is a threat. A woman with authority is a scandal. And the fastest way to turn that scandal into public consensus is to frame it in terms of sexual transgression. Isabella lived another 3 decades after her fall, quietly, carefully, in respectable confinement. She was allowed to visit family, attend ceremonies, but she was never again trusted near the engine of rule. History never quite forgave her. The she-wolf label stuck, even as modern historians have dismantled its foundations. They now point out how the chronicler's obsession with her personal life served to obscure her political intelligence, her strategic acumen, and her very modern refusal to accept silent disempowerment. But the reputation remains. Because Isabella did what medieval England feared most, not just as a queen, but as a woman. She acted without permission, she ruled without apology, and she made it clear that the throne, once shaken, could never again pretend it was untouchable. And if the political system managed to survive her, it would not survive the woman who came next. Because where Isabella ruled in crisis, the next royal would rule in comfort. And the real scandal was just how much power she wielded from behind a curtain of silk, wit, and pearls. 8. Edward III, King of England. When Edward III took the throne from his mother and Mortimer in a sudden, bloodless coup at the age of 17, the official story went something like this. The rightful king had finally come of age and stepped in to restore order. What went unsaid, but was deeply understood, was that a teenage boy had just overthrown a queen and her companion because their authority was beginning to embarrass the architecture of power. To many nobles, Edward's actions were not just a political correction. They were a moral reset. His rise marked a return to proper kingship, as if the previous 4 years had been a brief, feverish hallucination in which queens ruled and scandal wrote policy. And Edward, aware of how precarious his legitimacy was, made a show of it. He executed Mortimer in public, placed his mother under respectable house arrest, and performed the part of the dutiful monarch with the kind of righteous timing that wins applause in history books. For a while it worked. Edward became one of the most celebrated kings in English history. He launched successful military campaigns in France, cultivated the cult of chivalry, and helped shape what would later be known as the 100 Years' War. His reign began with fire and ended in decay, but in between, he gave England something it hadn't had in a generation, a king who looked and acted like the storybooks said he should. But like many kings who live long enough to age in public, Edward's legacy didn't remain unblemished. Power, after all, rarely leaves its host untouched. As the king grew older and the war dragged on, his rule began to fray, not with rebellion or invasion, but from within. And at the center of the rot stood a woman named Alice Perrers. Perrers was a commoner, a merchant's daughter, possibly a lady-in-waiting, possibly a ghost in the records, until suddenly she was everywhere. She became Edward's mistress in his later years, when his queen, Philippa of Hainault, was declining in health. What began as private companionship soon turned into political visibility, and then, as always, into scandal. The complaints didn't start with her presence in the king's chambers. They began when she started showing up in courtrooms. Literally. Alice Perrers, not content with being a royal mistress in the traditional ornamental sense, began appearing in legal proceedings, dressed in gold, veiled for modesty, and speaking on behalf of petitioners. She took part in property disputes, influenced judgments, issued opinions. According to chroniclers, she even had the gall to speak from behind the king's throne, a breach of protocol so jarring it nearly burned holes in the royal tapestry. To the nobility and the increasingly alarmed parliament, this was not just indecorous, it was unthinkable. A woman, not of noble birth, not a queen, not even titled, exercising judicial influence. In the king's court, this was monarchy turned inside out. By the 1370s, the complaints were public. The Good Parliament of 1376, the first in English history to call itself that, launched a full-throated assault on what they called the corruption of the royal household. Perrers was singled out by name. She was accused of using her position to enrich herself, to influence appointments, to manipulate the justice system for personal gain. She was cast not just as a royal concubine, but as a kind of secular Jezebel, the woman who seduced not the king's body, but the king's reason. Edward, increasingly ill and possibly senile, did little to stop her. That silence was taken as complicity. Eventually, under mounting pressure, Parliament forced her expulsion from court. She was formally charged with interfering in legal proceedings and was ordered to avoid the king entirely. It was a theatrical purge meant to restore confidence. But the damage was already done. The scandal of Alice Perrers was not sexual in the way earlier royal controversies had been. There were no public accusations of depravity, no descriptions of vice. Instead, the shock lay in her access, her influence, the way she seemed to bypass every acceptable channel and simply speak with the king's voice, without wearing his crown. It was, in a sense, a subtler kind of indecency, not of flesh but of function. Perrers represented everything the English political establishment feared. That intimacy with the monarch could displace institutions. That a single woman, through charisma and timing, could unravel decades of careful feudal choreography. And most importantly, that the king might allow it. After Edward's death in 1377, Perrers tried to keep her head down. She vanished into private life, remarried, and lived for another 2 decades. But her name remained radioactive. Chronicles continued to invoke her as a warning. Parliamentary records cited her as the reason royal mistresses should be watched, regulated, perhaps even legislated out of existence. But the truth is, Alice Perrers did nothing new. She simply did it visibly. She stepped into a vacuum left by a fading king, filled it with her voice, and discovered that power wears many disguises. Her scandal wasn't born from immorality. It was born from visibility. From the unbearable discomfort of watching a woman exercise agency in a place where influence was supposed to be male, titled and hidden behind advisors with the right seals. Her rise and fall foreshadowed a new era, one in which Parliament would assert itself more boldly and the king's inner circle would become a matter of national concern. But before England could rewrite its monarchy, it would experience another collapse. This time in the form of a child king with too many favorites, too few instincts, and a dangerous willingness to repeat every mistake his great-grandfather had just barely survived. Because Alice Perrers may have whispered behind the throne, but Richard II would build his entire court around echoes. 9. Richard III, King of England. Richard II came to the throne at the tender age of 10, crowned, anointed, and dressed in ceremonial robes that dragged behind him like the weight of other people's expectations. England didn't get a child. It got a royal symbol with no agency and an empty throne everyone else tried to sit in. In the early years, his reign was managed by councils, regents, and a rotating cast of noble puppeteers. But even as a boy, Richard had a talent for performance. He understood ceremony, symbolism, the power of presence. He staged elaborate pageants, styled himself as a semi-divine monarch, and made it very clear, once he came of age, he wasn't going to be anybody's puppet. And true to his word, he wasn't. He became something much worse. A king ruled by intimacy. Like his great-grandfather Edward II, whose fate should have served as a cautionary tale, Richard grew deeply attached to a series of young male courtiers. The most infamous of these was Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. De Vere wasn't just a favorite. He was, in the words of his detractors, a shadow monarch. The language used against him echoed a familiar pattern: arrogant, effeminate, foreign-influenced, corrupt. Whispered insinuations about the nature of his closeness to Richard flooded the political scene. No direct accusations of physical misconduct, just enough poetic venom to poison the court. One chronicler described the pair's relationship as so intense that Richard loved him beyond measure, a phrase that might pass unremarked in a poem, but carries a different weight in a king's biography. The nobles didn't need to say the word. The implication was enough. Too much closeness, too little distance, a private relationship becoming a public problem. The scandal wasn't about love or even about preference. It was about access. De Vere received titles far beyond his station, bypassed traditional noble hierarchies, and seemed to wield influence in ways that made Parliament nervous and the older nobility furious. He was named Duke of Ireland, an absurd elevation that felt more like a coronation. Suddenly there were two kings, one with a crown and one with Richard's ear. And then came the backlash. In 1387, a group of powerful nobles known as the Lords Appellant took action. They accused De Vere and other royal favorites of treason, specifically for misleading the king and corrupting royal governance. The charges were dramatic, the trials theatrical, and the punishments decisive. De Vere fled the country, only to die in exile, reportedly in a hunting accident that felt suspiciously tidy. Richard never forgave the humiliation. He bided his time, played the long game, and waited. When he regained full control of the throne in the 1390s, he began a campaign of revenge against the Lords Appellant, executing or exiling them with cold precision. It was, by all accounts, a purge disguised as justice. But his court never recovered its balance. By then, Richard had surrounded himself with a new cadre of favorites, men who reinforced his taste for luxury, his appetite for control, and his allergy to criticism. His reign became a kind of royal theater, elaborate court rituals, extravagant clothing, gold-threaded fabrics, and choreographed power. He even commissioned an oversized personal crown, heavy with jewels, as if trying to remind everyone, including himself, that he was untouchable. Except he wasn't. The deeper scandal of Richard II wasn't just about favorites or extravagance or rumored intimacies. It was the slow erosion of the boundary between the king's private world and the machinery of state. His personal affections dictated policy. His emotions directed diplomacy. If he liked you, you were promoted. If he didn't, you were erased. Governance became a matter of mood, and for a king with a thin skin and a long memory, that was dangerous. By the late 1390s, Richard began punishing critics with alarming efficiency. Nobles were imprisoned without trial. Land was confiscated. Parliament was packed with loyalists. He demanded oaths of allegiance, not to the crown, but to his person. He styled himself not just as a monarch, but as a messianic figure chosen by God. It was a performance with no audience. The country grew weary. The nobles grew resentful. And Henry Bolingbroke, exiled, disinherited, and seething, returned from France with an army and a grudge. Richard, caught off guard, was deposed in 1399 with stunning speed. He surrendered without a fight, possibly believing that the performance could still be salvaged. It couldn't. He was imprisoned, quietly disposed of, and buried without ceremony. No legacy, no monument. Just a memory shaped by rumor and silence. And the rumors lingered, because Richard's court had been shrouded in coded language and aesthetic ambiguity. His relationships with men like De Vere weren't confirmed or denied. They were described in ways that invited suspicion, emotional excess, political favoritism, unnatural affections. The accusations mirrored those hurled at Edward II, but with a theatrical flair. Richard was too polished, too refined, too fond of beauty. His court was filled with silk instead of steel, and in a world where kings were expected to embody martial virtue, this was treated not as a preference, but as a threat. Modern historians tread carefully when discussing Richard's sexuality. The sources are slippery, steeped in polemic and metaphor. There's no smoking gun, just smoke. But smoke in medieval politics was often enough. What's clear is this. Richard's downfall was framed in moral terms. His politics were called feminine. His affection suspicious. His rule illegitimate not just because it was authoritarian, but because it was emotional. The scandal wasn't who he loved. It was that love appeared to govern, and that, for medieval England, was the final heresy. Because kings could sin with swords. They could kill. They could steal. But they could not allow affection to cloud the throne, especially when that affection bent the wrong way in the eyes of church, state, and tradition. Richard died unwept, unwritten, and unpardoned. But his story didn't vanish. It infected the bloodstream of royal history, a cautionary tale in velvet gloves. And as the throne passed to men who fought, conquered, and broke oaths with less style and more blood, the lesson remained. Even queens could rule, if they did it silently. But a king who ruled through love? That was the most perverse threat of all. And speaking of romantic chaos disguised as dynastic legitimacy, let's talk about Joan of Kent. 10. Joan of Kent. Joan of Kent was born into scandal, married into controversy, and died as the mother of a boy destined to become one of England's most controversial kings. But long before she became the so-called Fair Maid of Kent, or mother to Richard II, Joan had already earned herself a place in the whispered legends of English court life. Just not for the reasons you'd expect. Her story begins with lineage. Joan wasn't just a royal cousin or a distant noble. She was the granddaughter of Edward I, niece to Edward II, and cousin to Edward III. That meant her very existence pulsed near the bloodstream of the crown. A reminder that even in a monarchy, the real danger was never just across the sea. It was already inside the palace. And Joan, from her youth, seemed to prove it. She was beautiful, by all accounts, but more importantly, she was dangerously autonomous in a system designed to reward silent compliance. Her early years were marked by tragedy. Her father, executed as a traitor while she was still an infant, but her childhood was spent in the royal household raised alongside princes. She learned early how to move through court circles, how to charm, how to maneuver. But at 16, she made a move no one expected. She married without permission. Her chosen husband was Thomas Holland, a young knight who had neither title nor sufficient rank. The marriage was, at best, politically inconvenient. At worst, it was illegal. Worse still, Joan kept it secret. Whether she feared her family's disapproval or simply acted out of impulse is unclear. What is clear is that, while Holland went abroad on military duty, Joan's family arranged another marriage for her. This time to William Montague, the son of an earl, and far more socially acceptable. Joan said nothing. She let the second marriage go forward. Whether she hoped to annul the first or simply intended to survive the politics is anyone's guess. What followed was years of legal and moral chaos. Joan, now technically married to two men, found herself at the center of a bitter dispute that tested not just canon law, but the tolerance of a medieval society for female autonomy. When Holland returned and demanded his wife back, it became a royal scandal. The case eventually went to the Pope himself, and in one of the most quietly explosive rulings of the era, he declared the first marriage valid. Joan was ordered back to Holland, Montague's marriage was annulled, and the court was left to mop up the embarrassment. The fact that the Pope ruled in Joan's favor speaks volumes, not just about the strength of her case, but about the political weight behind it. She had managed, however unintentionally, to undermine the machinery of arranged marriage and still emerge with her reputation intact. But reputations, in court life, are rarely determined by legality. Whispers followed Joan for the rest of her life. Accusations of impropriety, questions about whether the initial marriage had been consummated before the second. Chroniclers, always fond of moral subtext, made careful note of the confusion. Some cast her as naive, others painted her as dangerously seductive, and others, mostly modern historians, note that what really made her scandalous was that she insisted on being a participant in her own life story. Her marriage to Holland, once validated, became relatively stable. They had children. She gained experience as a noblewoman. But it was after his death that Joan stepped back into the public eye, and back into controversy. In 1361, she married again. This time, it was no knight or compromised noble. It was Edward, the Black Prince. Son of the king, heir to the throne, war hero. A marriage of that scale came with stakes. Edward had been raised as the very embodiment of martial English virtue, stoic, strategic, admired. Joan, on the other hand, was already twice married, once excommunicated, and still carrying the echoes of youthful scandal. Their union raised eyebrows. Some accounts say Edward married her for love, others suggest political strategy, but whatever the cause, their relationship caused unease. The court questioned whether Joan, with her tangle of past marriages and independent streak, was fit for the role of future queen. She didn't fit the usual mold of royal consort. She had already defied church law. She had already disrupted inheritance networks. And worst of all, she wasn't easily controlled. The couple had 2 sons, the second of whom, Richard, would become Richard II. But tragedy stalked the household. The Black Prince fell into a slow and painful illness. Joan cared for him, earning some public sympathy, but the political sphere was less forgiving. Her position, always viewed as precarious, became more so after Edward's death, and when her son ascended the throne as a child, Joan became the mother of a king, but not the regent. Still, her influence endured. Joan was politically active during the early years of Richard's reign. She interceded on behalf of nobles, smoothed over conflicts, and attempted to restrain her son's harsher instincts. In many ways, she was the kingdom's silent diplomat, the human buffer between a precocious king and the lords who feared him. And yet, she was never quite trusted. Her past marriages, the legal confusion, the papal drama, had permanently stamped her as morally complex. She wasn't a saint, she wasn't a villain, she was a woman who had made her own decisions and survived them. In royal history, that's often the most scandalous thing of all. Joan died in 1385 quietly, away from court. But her legacy was already in motion. Her son's reign would implode in familiar patterns. Unchecked favorites, rumors of intimacy, and a governing style shaped more by personal loyalty than constitutional restraint. In that sense, Joan's greatest scandal may not have been her marriages or the whispers they produced. It may have been the example she left behind, a legacy of emotional politics, legal complexity, and self-determination in a world that preferred its queens passive and its mothers silent. Because the next king wouldn't just inherit her blood, he would inherit her chaos. And unlike Joan, he would drag the church, Europe, and a string of terrified wives down with him. 11. Henry VIII, King of England. Henry VIII didn't stumble into scandal. He built a palace for it, staffed it, fed it, married it, divorced it, executed it, and then asked history to admire the architecture. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he looked like the opposite of everything that had gone wrong before him. Young, athletic, handsome, piously educated. A prince engineered to erase the awkward legacies of child kings, overmighty favorites, and whispered court intrigues. He was supposed to be stability incarnate, and for a brief, glittering moment, he was. Then he discovered that kingship came with appetite. Henry's private life became public policy, not because he was unusually immoral by the standards of his time, but because he was unusually unwilling to accept limits. Medieval kings had mistresses. Renaissance kings had mistresses. Henry had a theological crisis every time he wanted to change partners. What followed wasn't just gossip, it was institutional collapse. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon was meant to anchor England to Spain and the Catholic world. For over 20 years, Catherine fulfilled her role with dignity, surviving pregnancies, losses, and the quiet cruelty of a husband who began to see her not as a queen, but as an obstacle. The problem wasn't that Henry wanted someone else. The problem was that he wanted permission to stop pretending. When Catherine failed to produce a surviving male heir, Henry began to reinterpret scripture with remarkable creativity. His marriage, he decided, had never been valid. God was displeased. The lack of a son was proof. What followed was not a private annulment, but a national obsession. Lawyers were summoned, cardinals consulted, universities pressured. The Pope stalled. Henry did not. His pursuit of Anne Boleyn wasn't just romantic, it was ideological. Anne refused to be a mistress. She insisted on legitimacy. And Henry, rather than accept rejection, decided to rewrite the rules of Christendom. England broke with Rome. The king became supreme head of the church. Monasteries were dissolved. Centuries of religious structure collapsed, not because of doctrine, but because one man wanted a marriage approved on his own terms. This is where Henry's sexuality becomes historically dangerous. It wasn't the number of women. It was the scale of destruction left in their wake. Anne Boleyn became queen amid whispers, resentment, and open hostility. Her rise was treated as proof that unchecked desire could destabilize the world. When she failed to deliver the long-awaited son quickly enough, the atmosphere turned lethal. Charges were constructed. Courts assembled. The language of moral horror returned with surgical precision. Anne was removed, condemned, and erased. Her alleged private sins repackaged as justification for public execution. Henry remarried within days. Jane Seymour offered what Anne could not: obedience, quiet, and eventually, a son. Edward's birth redeemed everything, briefly. Jane died soon after, and Henry mourned her sincerely, or at least theatrically. But the pattern was set. Women entered the court as solutions and exited as liabilities. Marriage became transactional, temporary, and terrifying. By this point, Henry's reputation across Europe was radioactive. Ambassadors reported with a mixture of fascination and dread. Court gossip hardened into expectation. No queen was safe. The king's affections were volatile, his favor unpredictable, and his punishment spectacular. Henry's later marriages, political, impulsive, humiliating, only reinforced the image. Anne of Cleves survived by being inconveniently unappealing. Catherine Howard did not survive her youth, her past, or the court's appetite for moral theater. Each marriage fed the narrative of a king whose desires were no longer private urges, but national emergencies. But Henry's scandals weren't confined to women. There were persistent whispers, never officially acknowledged, about his relationships with men. Favorites like Charles Brandon and Thomas Wolsey enjoyed extraordinary intimacy and influence. Letters survive filled with affectionate language that makes modern readers pause. Again, context matters. Early modern male friendship allowed emotional expression that feels startling now. But in Henry's case, the intensity of attachment always coincided with political power. When those relationships soured, the consequences were swift. Wolsey fell from grace spectacularly. Others vanished quietly. Favor for Henry was never just affection. It was leverage. And above all of this loomed control. Henry demanded absolute obedience, not just in governance, but in belief. He executed those who challenged his marriages as traitors. He punished dissenters who refused to acknowledge his supremacy. He weaponized morality, loyalty, and fear in equal measure. His private life became the engine of the state, grinding institutions into compliance. By the end of his reign, Henry was physically diminished but politically terrifying. His court was silent. His wives were dead, discarded, or carefully distant. His son was young and fragile, and England was permanently altered. Henry VIII is often remembered as a caricature. Gluttonous, temperamental, absurdly married. But that misses the real scandal. His sexuality, his insistence that desire must be satisfied, sanctified, and obeyed, reshaped the nation's soul. He proved that a king's bedroom could dismantle monasteries, redraw theology, and normalize fear as governance. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. Henry didn't see himself as excessive. He saw himself as righteous, chosen, corrected by God through appetite and punishment alike. In his mind, every marriage was justified, every execution necessary, every scandal a misunderstanding. History, of course, disagreed, and the women who followed him into the throne room learned the hard way that, in Henry's England, virtue offered no protection, only usefulness did. Which brings us inevitably to the woman whose rise and fall would define this era of royal obsession. Because Anne Boleyn wasn't just another wife. She was the hinge on which an entire kingdom broke. 12. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. If Henry VIII cracked the kingdom open with desire, Anne Boleyn was the woman who walked through the wreckage wearing a crown. By the time she became queen, Anne was already infamous. Not because she was born scandalous, she wasn't, but because her very survival strategy within Henry's orbit required a level of calculation that medieval society found unforgivable in a woman. Charm was expected. Ambition was dangerous. Anne had both. She was the daughter of a well-positioned but not particularly powerful noble family. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, had leveraged court politics with quiet skill, sending Anne to the Netherlands and then to the French court as part of her early education. She returned to England fluent in French, trained in courtly etiquette, and armed with a new weapon, allure. Not just beauty, though she had enough of that to draw attention, but intelligence, charisma, and a sense of her own value. Anne's refusal to become just another royal mistress was what made her scandalous. She didn't play the role of seductress in the traditional sense. She played the role of prize. When Henry approached her with his typical expectations, she refused him, carefully, persistently. She didn't insult him, she just didn't yield. And that did more than intrigue the king. It rewired him. What began as infatuation evolved into obsession. Henry had affairs before Anne, and he would have affairs after. But Anne was different. She offered not gratification, but a vision of legitimacy. She demanded marriage, not as a proposal, but as a condition. This wasn't just bold, it was treasonous by implication. To marry Anne, Henry would need to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Queen, the Spanish princess, the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor. The woman the Pope had already refused to unqueen. What followed was nearly a decade of legal, religious, and political chaos. Henry's great matter was not just a marriage dispute. It was a national crisis. He sent envoys across Europe. He pressured clergy. He appealed to theology. The entire religious framework of England twisted around his desire for Anne. To her critics, this was proof of her sin. No woman could be the cause of such upheaval and remain innocent. She was painted as a witch, a seductress, a schemer. Catholic polemicists called her Jezebel. Protestants later tried to reframe her as a martyr. Neither version felt quite accurate. In reality, Anne was a survivor. She read the political map and played the only hand available to her. Insist on legitimacy or risk becoming disposable. She was crowned queen in 1533, already pregnant with her first child. It was not the triumph it should have been. The people murmured, the court glared. Catherine still had sympathizers. And Anne's condition, her swelling belly, so full of political hope, was now the test case for the entire English Reformation. She gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but not defeated. He still believed a son would come. Anne became pregnant again and miscarried. Then again, and again, the child did not survive. By 1536, the atmosphere around Anne had curdled. Her failure to produce a male heir wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political liability. Henry, once willing to burn kingdoms for her, began to look elsewhere. And in that gap, between his attention and his indifference, Anne's enemies moved. The accusations came swiftly. Adultery, treason, incest. Charges so grotesque they would have been laughable if they hadn't been deadly. Anne was accused of sleeping with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The case was built on whispered statements, coerced confessions, and the convenient interpretation of timing. Historians now generally agree that the charges were fabricated, politically engineered to remove Anne without triggering another religious crisis. But the legal truth didn't matter. The theater did. Anne was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower, and tried by a jury of nobles who knew better than to deliver the wrong verdict. The proceedings were soaked in formality and rot. Witnesses spoke in vague terms. Dates were manipulated. Her fall was choreographed, not discovered. She was found guilty. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by sword, an unusual mercy imported from France. She gave a composed speech, refused to criticize the king, and died as she had lived, aware of the performance and determined to play her role well. But her story didn't end there. Her daughter, Elizabeth, survived, and decades later she would become queen in her own right, reshaping England with a political brilliance that made Anne's enemies look provincial in retrospect. But even in Elizabeth's reign, Anne's shadow lingered. Rumors continued. Was she a witch, a traitor, a reformer? The interpretations shifted with the politics. What made Anne truly scandalous wasn't sex or seduction. It was her refusal to be passive. She didn't stumble into Henry's bed. She walked into his court and demanded recognition. She understood how power moved, and she tried briefly and fatally to shape it. In a world where women were supposed to be symbols, Anne insisted on being a subject, and that broke the machinery. Henry would marry again several times, but none of his other wives triggered the structural collapse Anne did. She wasn't a mistress turned queen. She was a woman who gambled everything on legitimacy, and lost. Yet her legacy outlived her. In Elizabeth, in Protestant England, in the very idea that a woman could stand at the center of a nation's future. But before that future could unfold, Henry had more damage to do, because the next queen wasn't just a wife, she was a warning. 13. Catherine Howard, Queen of England. Catherine Howard was perhaps the most tragic of Henry VIII's wives, not because of her crimes, but because of her context. She entered the royal court already marked by the very forces that would later destroy her: youth, beauty, ambition, and the unforgiving memory of other people's sins. When she married Henry in 1540, Catherine was somewhere between 16 and 18. Henry was 49, ailing, obese, and haunted by his failed marriages. Anne Boleyn had already been beheaded. Jane Seymour had died in childbirth. Anne of Cleves had been set aside after Henry deemed her unattractive. The court was on edge. The king was unpredictable. And Catherine Howard, charming, flirtatious, and visibly alive, was the perfect distraction. She was also Anne Boleyn's cousin. That should have been a warning sign. But the court, like Henry, had a short memory for consequences and a long memory for beauty. Catherine had been raised in the household of the Dowager, Duchess of Norfolk, a chaotic environment that functioned more like a finishing school with no finishing. She was surrounded by noble youths, little supervision, and a culture that blurred the lines between courtly affection and private risk. By the time she arrived at court, Catherine had already experienced romantic entanglements, something that, in a different context, would have been ordinary. But in Henry's court, her past would become a time bomb. At first, she thrived. The aging king called her his rose without a thorn. She dazzled at court events, brought youth and energy to a palace weighed down by anxiety and political fatigue. She wore rich fabrics, smiled at the right moments, and managed to project the illusion of purity that Henry so desperately needed to believe in. But the cracks were already showing. Court whispers began, rumors of past lovers, questions about her conduct before she became queen. The names Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper surfaced, men connected to Catherine's earlier life, one from her adolescence, the other allegedly from her queenship. In an ordinary noblewoman, these would be indiscretions. In a queen, they were fatal. The political environment around Henry had changed. The Reformation was in full swing. The court was divided into factions, reformers and conservatives, each eager to gain the king's ear and destroy the opposition. Catherine became a pawn in this factional war. Once suspicion attached to her, her enemies moved quickly. Evidence was gathered. Confessions were extracted, some under pressure, some through self-preservation. Derham admitted to having been involved with Catherine before her queenship. Culpeper, a favored gentleman of the king's chamber, was accused of illicit meetings with the queen during her marriage. Whether these meetings amounted to anything more than flirtation is unclear. But in Henry's mind, ambiguity was already guilt. The betrayal, real or perceived, was too much. What followed was a carefully orchestrated collapse. Catherine was interrogated, placed under house arrest, stripped of her titles, and eventually imprisoned in the Tower. She was charged with treason, not because of what she had done before her marriage, but because of what she was accused of doing after. It's worth pausing here to consider the moral hypocrisy. Henry, by this point, had fathered multiple illegitimate children, conducted numerous affairs, and married 5 times. But Catherine's alleged actions were treated as sacrilege. Her past was weaponized, her youth ignored, her position as a political scapegoat ensured. The same court that had smiled at her coronation now demanded her death. She was beheaded on February 13, 1542. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she left no grand speeches, no final performance. The most enduring quote attributed to her is simple and devastating. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Whether she said it or not, or doesn't matter. It lingers because it feels true, because it captures the essential injustice of her fall. Catherine Howard's scandal was not, in truth, about sexual misconduct. It was about surveillance, control, and the impossibility of reinvention in a court that recorded everything and forgave nothing. She tried to survive by charm. She failed because charm was not protection. Her downfall was engineered not by lovers, but by politics, by men who saw in her the opportunity to realign power. Her youth was used against her. Her past was held up as prophecy. Her downfall was a morality play with a pre-written ending. And Henry, who once called her his jewel, did nothing to stop it. He had her executed, and then went back to planning his next marriage. Catherine's life reminds us that in the Tudor court, personal history was a legal liability. That survival required not just virtue, but strategy. And that for women, especially queens, the past was never past. It was evidence. She died surrounded by silence. No mourners, no monument. Just another footnote in a reign that had turned scandal into governance. But her execution did more than close a chapter. It intensified the fear around the throne. Henry's court became quieter, colder, more suspicious. Every lady-in-waiting became a possible liability. Every smile, a potential conspiracy. And within that paranoia, one figure loomed larger than most. A man who had always lingered at the edge of power, charming the court, testing boundaries, and finally falling headfirst into a scandal that would redefine how dangerous proximity to royalty could be. Because while Catherine Howard was destroyed by whispers from her past, Thomas Seymour would be undone by how loudly he imagined his future. 14. Thomas Seymour, Lord High Admiral. In a court already haunted by beheaded queens, whispering courtiers, and the ever-present ghost of Henry VIII's wrath, Thomas Seymour brought a different kind of danger. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a prince, but he was exactly close enough to both, and dangerously confident in what that meant. You could argue Thomas Seymour's true scandal wasn't his personal behavior, but his unwavering belief that he should be just as important as the men who wore crowns. He was the younger brother of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of England, who held near kingly power during the minority reign of Edward VI. In theory, Thomas should have been content with that proximity to power. In practice, he was furious about it. History often treats him like a footnote, or worse, as a punchline, the reckless uncle who got too ambitious. But beneath that reputation is a more unsettling truth. Thomas Seymour was a man who knew exactly how the court worked and how to charm his way into its most vulnerable corners. After Henry VIII's death in 1547, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, took the throne. real power passed into the hands of a regency council, dominated by Thomas's older brother. But Thomas wanted his own sphere of influence, his own access to the crown. And he began maneuvering with a mix of charisma, ambition, and a kind of calculated recklessness that made him impossible to ignore. His first major move was marrying the Dowager Queen. Only a few months after Henry's death, Thomas quietly married Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife. The marriage shocked the court, not because it was illegal, but because it was indecently fast. Catherine had been the king's wife. Now she was Thomas's. And while she had once served as a maternal figure to the young Princess Elizabeth, she was now hosting her in a household that quickly became morally complicated. It's here that the story of Thomas Seymour starts to drift into darker waters, not because of any confirmed crime, but because of the sheer density of uncomfortable moments. At this time, Princess Elizabeth was living under the guardianship of Catherine and Thomas. She was about 13 or 14 years old, intellectually brilliant, politically aware, and already forced to navigate a world that saw her as both a threat and a prize. Thomas Seymour, for reasons known only to him and carefully dissected by everyone else, began paying her unusual attention. Accounts from household servants describe morning visits, Thomas entering Elizabeth's bedchamber while she was still in bed, tickle fights, slap-and-run games, chasing her around the garden. None of it sounds overtly scandalous in isolation, but the pattern, especially coming from a 40-year-old man responsible for her care, left contemporaries deeply uneasy, especially since Elizabeth, even as a teenager, seemed to understand that these interactions were walking a very fine line. Eventually, Catherine Parr herself began to suspect things had gone too far. She tried to control the situation, sometimes by joining in the morning games to diffuse the intimacy. But the tension was clear, and so was the danger. Elizabeth was removed from the household and sent away, politely, quietly, but decisively. It was damage control dressed in courtesy. Meanwhile, Thomas's political ambition only grew more frantic. He tried to gain influence over young King Edward by bribing the servants who controlled access to the royal bedchamber. He offered the boy pocket money, promised him greater autonomy, and floated the idea that maybe, just maybe, Edward didn't need his Lord Protector quite so much. Thomas wanted to replace his brother at the center of power. He saw himself as the rightful paternal figure to the boy king. This wasn't mere court gossip. It was documented, interrogated, investigated. And when it all came to light, it was enough to make the Privy Council turn on him in coordinated fury. In 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason. His various schemes, ambitions, and indiscretions finally caught up with him. During his trial, the council focused less on the inappropriate behavior with Elizabeth. Those episodes remained unsettling but vague, and more on his political manipulations, his reckless attempts to undermine the protectorate, and his obsessive need to matter. He was convicted and executed by beheading on March 20th, 1549. His death was officially attributed to treason, but the real charges, the moral charges, were harder to articulate. He had inserted himself too forcefully into royal intimacy. He had destabilized the fragile regency with selfish ambition. And worst of all, he had hovered around the future Queen of England with the hungry arrogance of a man who believed proximity granted permission. Elizabeth, years later, would speak very little about Thomas Seymour. When she did, she chose her words with forensic care. She never outright condemned him, but she never forgot. Her court would be fiercely controlled, coldly pragmatic, and marked by a refusal to let any man, courtier or counselor, take up too much space. Because she had learned early what Thomas Seymour made painfully clear, royal intimacy is a weapon, and in the wrong hands, even affection can become strategy. But Seymour's scandal wasn't the first to blur the line between male favoritism and political threat. Because before him, long before him, there was a king who openly surrounded himself with men whose influence stirred not just courtly jealousy, but national anxiety. And when people whispered about James Force in his favorites, they didn't just ask what the king was doing, they asked what it meant for the kingdom. 15. James VI of Scotland, King of England. When James I ascended to the English throne in 1603, already James VI of Scotland for nearly 40 years, England wasn't just getting a king. It was inheriting a man with a reputation, a court with a rumor mill, and a personal style of kingship that made Elizabeth's chilly aloofness look like monastic restraint. James had been raised in the sharp shadow of political conspiracy. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been executed by Elizabeth I. He'd grown up amid plots, threats, and the never-quite-trusted warmth of Scottish nobility. By the time he arrived in England, he understood power not as a divine right, but as a performance that had to be constantly maintained, and if possible, enjoyed. Because James didn't rule like a soldier. He ruled like a patron, a talker, a man more at ease in intellectual debates than in battlefield inspections. He filled his court with poets, scholars, and most significantly, young male courtiers whose beauty and charm made everyone else very nervous. The scandal of James I wasn't that he had favorites. All monarchs did. It was that he had them so openly, so emotionally, and in ways that blurred the line between affection, authority, and desire. The whispers began long before he ever set foot in England. In Scotland, his relationship with Esme Stuart, the Duke of Lennox, had caused alarm. Esme, a French Catholic cousin, had rapidly become the center of James's life when James was in his early teens. Their closeness was undeniable. So was the public reaction. Scottish nobles feared the influence of a foreign Catholic on their Protestant boy king. Esme was exiled. James was devastated. But the pattern had been set. In England, his most infamous favorite was George Villiers, later the Duke of Buckingham. Handsome, poised, and devastatingly ambitious, Villiers met James in 1614 and rose with such breathtaking speed that even hardened courtiers were stunned. Within a few years, he had become not just the king's confidant, but arguably the second most powerful man in the kingdom. James showered him with titles, lands, and affection. He wrote him letters filled with phrases that made even seasoned diplomats squirm. "I desire only to live in this world for your sake," he wrote in one. "I had rather live banished in any part of the earth with you than live a sorrowful widow's life without you." Now, modern historians are quick to point out that early modern language of male friendship often included strong emotional and even romantic language without necessarily implying a sexual relationship. But even by those standards, James's letters to Villiers are intense. They're not brotherly. They're not platonic in the comfortable, politically convenient way. They are full of longing, jealousy, tenderness, and obsession. And the court noticed. Political rivals accused Villiers of manipulating the king. Pamphlets circulated, not just satirical, but openly venomous. The public wasn't just uncomfortable with how fast Villiers had risen. It was with why. His enemies didn't have to say the word sodomy. They just had to mention the gifts, the kisses, the private access, the sway over appointments and royal decisions. The message was clear. Buckingham wasn't just a court favorite. He was something worse, something unnatural. And that unnaturalness didn't stay confined to rumors. It became part of how people talked about the king himself. James's reign, especially in its later years, was seen as indulgent, corrupt, and morally compromised, not because of policy, but because of perceived intimacy. He wasn't tyrannical. He was too distracted, too soft, too dependent on young men who flattered him, used him, and distorted the machinery of state. This perception wasn't just about Villiers. It extended to others like Robert Carr, the earlier Earl of Somerset, who had also enjoyed meteoric rise through personal favor. But it was Villiers who became the emblem of the king's affections, and, for many, his weakness. The irony is that James was, in many ways, a thoughtful and intelligent king. He authored political treatises. He believed passionately in the divine right of kings. He cultivated culture, unified the English and Scottish crowns, and tried to maintain peace in a Europe addicted to war. But none of that mattered once the court decided that his private emotions made him politically illegitimate. The legacy of his favoritism would haunt the throne long after James died. His son, Charles I, inherited not only the kingdom, but Villiers himself. And Charles's loyalty to the Duke of Buckingham would lead directly into political chaos, military disaster, and eventually, civil war. But James I's true scandal wasn't about whether he loved his favorites too deeply. It was about how openly he did it. He didn't hide his letters. He didn't obscure his affections. He brought Villiers into every corner of the royal household. At court, in council, on the stage of international diplomacy, he turned personal affection into political currency, and the realm paid the price. In the end, James died quietly, leaving behind a kingdom that viewed his rule as decadent and vulnerable. Not because of cruelty, but because he was perceived as too emotionally pliable, too generous, too intimate with those who hadn't earned it. And if James set the stage for personal favoritism to shape policy, George Villiers would take center stage. Because a favorite can be charming. But when a favorite becomes a dynasty, the knives come out. 16. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. George Villiers was not born to power. He was born to dance near it, and then, somehow, became the man who taught the English court what it meant to be both indispensable and intolerable at the same time. By the time James I laid eyes on Villiers in 1614, the young man was already being quietly groomed for something bigger. Tall, strikingly handsome, and exquisitely dressed, he had the look of a royal favorite, and he moved through court life with the fluency of someone who understood that affection could be as much a political tool as it was a personal bond. It was a court obsessed with beauty, performance, and the theater of power, and Villiers knew exactly how to star in it. What followed was one of the most dramatic ascents in English court history. Within just a few years, George Villiers went from a minor gentleman to the Duke of Buckingham, Lord High Admiral, and virtually co-ruler in all but name. The king doted on him, wrote him letters, praised his looks openly, touched his face during council meetings. The whispers, of course, were immediate. The court called him Steenie, after the angelic face of St. Stephen. Behind his back, they called him worse. Satirists sharpened their pens. Pamphlets began to circulate suggesting, sometimes subtly, sometimes with outright venom, that Villiers was not merely the king's advisor, but his paramour. And James did little to dispel the rumors. If anything, he poured oil on the fire. "Christ had his John," James once said, "and I have my George." For those looking for confirmation of impropriety, it was enough. For those already dismayed at the growing influence of favorites, it was ammunition. But the scandal of George Villiers was never just about possible romance. It was about control. Villiers understood something that frightened the old guard. Power didn't have to come from blood or conquest. It could come from proximity, from charisma, from knowing when to be quiet and when to be irreplaceable. He filled royal spaces with his presence, and when James I leaned more on companionship than counsels, Villiers was always there, offering advice, pressing for titles, inserting himself into foreign policy. And while his charm was undeniable, so was his ambition. He married into nobility, secured positions for his allies, and made sure that loyalty to him often became the price of advancement. Those who opposed him found themselves stalled, exiled, or quietly dismantled. He was not content to be a royal favorite. He wanted to be a political force. And for a while, he succeeded. Then James I died in 1625, and Villiers did something that no royal favorite in England had ever truly managed. He survived the transition. Most favorites fall when the monarch does. They are, by nature, disposable, made for one reign, instantly dangerous to the next. But George Villiers remained in power under Charles I, the new king who had raised in his presence and saw him as both a friend and a fixture. But something changed. Under James, Villiers had been indulged. Under Charles, he was empowered. He directed naval expeditions, handled foreign diplomacy, and controlled royal access. His failures, of which there were many, were forgiven. His oversteps were justified. His enemies grew more numerous and more vocal, but still, he stood. The most public disaster came in the form of war. Villiers championed England's involvement in the failed military intervention to support the Protestant cause in Europe. Troops died. Allies abandoned them. Resources were wasted. Parliament turned on him. His reputation, already bruised by rumors of favoritism and excess, now cracked under the weight of military incompetence. Yet Charles refused to let him fall. Parliament began calling for his removal, then his impeachment, then, openly, his head. Charles dissolved Parliament rather than give him up. It was the start of a political crisis that would one day spiral into civil war. In the streets, people cursed his name. In pamphlets, he was portrayed as the embodiment of everything wrong with the monarchy. Decadent, foreign influence, sexually ambiguous, dangerously powerful. The fact that he had no clear office that justified his control only made him more threatening. He was everywhere and nowhere, trusted by the king, resented by the kingdom. In 1628, the question of Villiers' power was answered, not by a royal decree, but by a knife. He was stabbed to death in Portsmouth by John Felton, a disgruntled military officer who believed he was saving the country from tyranny. Felton's actions were not condemned. Crowds reportedly celebrated his arrest. His name became a shorthand for patriotic justice. Parliament refused to brand him insane. Villiers died at the height of his influence and left behind a political system that had already begun to rupture under his weight. His murder shocked the court, but validated the fears of a nation that had long suspected one man's private access could bend the course of empire. His real scandal wasn't just in what he may have done with the king behind closed doors. It was that he made favoritism a governing principle, that he treated the throne like a private stage, that he made the court feel less like a place of governance and more like a performance, one where he always had the best costume and the last word. And what followed, inevitably, was backlash. Because after Villiers, England would try to restore a sense of dignity and masculine restraint to the monarchy. Unfortunately, they got Charles II instead. And he didn't hide his favorites. He invited them all to bed, to court, and to Parliament, often in that order. 17. Charles II, King of England. Charles II didn't so much return to the English throne as he did slide back into it with a wink, a glass of wine, and a mistress on each arm. After 11 years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell and his joyless, color-drained protectorate, England was ready for a king who could laugh. Charles gave them that, and so much more than they bargained for. If the Restoration of 1660 was a national sigh of relief, Charles himself was the embodiment of that exhale. He was charismatic, clever, indulgent, and, most dangerously, deeply uninterested in pretending otherwise. He didn't posture as God's anointed instrument. He wasn't particularly obsessed with virtue. What he wanted was pleasure, stability, and to never again see a courtroom turned into a pulpit. His court was a deliberate reversal of the Cromwellian order, a place where vice was not hidden but hosted, and no part of Charles's reign illustrated that reversal more vividly than his unapologetically scandalous personal life. Where previous monarchs had mistresses discreetly tucked into the background, Charles made his visible. Public. Powerful. He gave them titles, estates, children, influence. His bedroom became a satellite office of the royal court, and no one seemed entirely certain whether seduction or succession was the more important agenda. Barbara Villiers, Louise de Querouaille, Nell Gwynn, Hortense Mancini, The list goes on, and it wasn't just the quantity that raised eyebrows, it was the brazenness. These women weren't just companions, they were institutions. Barbara Villiers, also known as Lady Castlemaine, was granted a position in the Queen's household, despite being openly loathed by the Queen herself. Her influence was legendary, and so was her temper. She wasn't a hidden indulgence. She was a public power broker. Charles fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, none by his queen, Catherine of Braganza, whose childlessness became one of the many quiet tragedies of her marriage. But where other kings might have seen their lack of legitimate heirs as a political vulnerability, Charles wore his situation like a loose cloak. He legitimized some of his children, married them into noble families, and ensured that their mothers remained comfortably maintained, if not always respected. His court became a theater of sensual politics. Painted ceilings, French fashions, poetry readings, and candlelit orgies were whispered about with increasing frustration by the more pious members of Parliament. For the old Puritans and the new moralists, Charles represented a moral collapse, but for many of his subjects, he represented something else: survival. The horrors of civil war were still fresh. A licentious king, they reasoned, was better than a righteous general. But Charles's libertinism wasn't without consequence. His favoritism, especially toward women with Catholic ties, unsettled a Protestant nation still recovering from sectarian trauma. His relationship with Louise de Querouaille, a French Catholic and suspected agent of Louis XIV, was especially troubling. Her presence at court wasn't just scandalous, it was strategic. Rumors swirled that she acted as a pipeline between Versailles and Whitehall, using her influence over Charles to push pro-French, pro-Catholic policies. And then there was Nell Gwynn, the king's famous Protestant mistress, who, unlike her rivals, used her position not to scheme, but to charm. A former actress with a sharp tongue and genuine affection for Charles, she became the people's favorite. When mistaken for a Catholic during an anti-Catholic riot, she allegedly leaned out of her carriage and shouted, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore!" The mob cheered. She lived. But no matter how endearing some of his companions were, Charles's use of intimacy as a tool of governance alarmed the political establishment. Mistresses had influence. Their children received titles. Their brothers got military commissions. The king's body had become a gate to patronage, and every favor granted through desire undermined the idea of a meritocratic court. Still, Charles had a genius for balance. He ruled through charm, timing, and strategic ambiguity. When Parliament pushed too hard, he prorogued it. When public opinion shifted, he shifted with it. He refused to name a legitimate heir, left succession murky, and played factions off one another like a seasoned gambler. His court's moral looseness became a cultural identity. Restoration drama flourished. Writers like Aphra Behn and William Wycherley turned court excess into satire. Paintings by Lely immortalized the king's mistresses in gauzy silk. Fashion became theatrical, witty, and vaguely French. It was a deliberate rebranding of monarchy as stylish rather than sacred. Yet beneath the laughter, England remained unsettled. The question of Catholic succession loomed. Charles's brother, James, Duke of York, was a confirmed Catholic. The fear of popery, stoked by fabricated plots and political pamphlets, began to grow. And as Charles aged, his refusal to legitimate an alternative Protestant heir began to look less like a quirk and more like a time bomb. When he died in 1685, he had left behind no legitimate heir, a Catholic brother poised to inherit the throne, and a court remembered more for its seductions than its policies. His final words, spoken to the gathered courtiers, were in keeping with the performative fatalism of his reign. "Let not poor Nellie starve." It was a personal request, not a political one. A king's last breath spent on a mistress. Charles II was not overthrown, exiled, or assassinated. He reigned for 25 years, keeping England just steady enough to avoid collapse, and just scandalous enough to ensure he would never be forgotten. But if Charles ruled through indulgence, The woman who followed him would learn how to rule through silence and use whispered rumors as weapons, because Queen Anne wasn't anyone's mistress. But they still found a way to make her intimacy scandalous. 18. Barbara Villiers, Lady Castlemaine. Barbara Villiers was the scandal England expected and still couldn't handle. If Charles II returned to the throne as the embodiment of indulgence, Barbara arrived at court as its unapologetic mascot. Beautiful, brazen, politically plugged in, and fatally uninterested in shame. In a court designed for performance, she played the part of royal mistress like it was a starring role, and she knew exactly when to break the fourth wall. Born into minor aristocracy and financial chaos, Barbara's father had died fighting for the royalist cause during the Civil War, and her family had lost their fortune. But Barbara, tall, magnetic, and spectacularly self-assured, was never going to settle for obscurity. She understood from a young age that the road to security in Restoration England wasn't lined with virtue. It was paved with proximity. Proximity to power. Proximity to men who mattered. Proximity to the king. She became Charles's mistress around 1660, the same year he was restored to the throne. The timing was not coincidental. Charles, newly returned from exile and surrounded by schemers, needed allies he could trust. And women, as it turned out, were often more reliable than courtiers with swords. Barbara gave him affection, loyalty, of a kind, and a convenient lack of inhibition. In return, Charles gave her access, titles, income, and the keys to his bedchamber, and his court. Barbara wasn't just a mistress in the private sense. She was installed in the Queen's household. She was made Lady of the Bedchamber to Catherine of Braganza, an appointment so insultingly audacious that even the Queen's defenders couldn't decide whether to laugh or revolt. Catherine, devout and devastated, had no choice but to accept her husband's decision. Charles had made it perfectly clear. Barbara Villiers wasn't a passing flirtation. She was policy. The scandal didn't begin with Barbara's position. It began with how she used it. She bore Charles 5 children. He acknowledged them all, bullied ministers, influenced appointments, and handled court patronage like a private ledger. She wasn't just a mistress. She was a faction. And factions need enemies. Barbara made them with industrial efficiency. Her relationship with Charles was stormy, loud, and often humiliating. She was notorious for screaming matches with the king, public displays of jealousy, and sudden exits from court only to return with even more jewelry and a better seat at dinner. Her rivals loathed her. Her allies feared her. The press, newly energized by the Restoration's easing of censorship, adored her, for all the wrong reasons. Pamphlets portrayed her as the emblem of royal corruption. Lascivious, foreign-influenced, greedy. She was accused of being a Catholic. She wasn't, at least not until later. A spy, unlikely. And the hand behind every unpopular appointment in government, often accurate. For Puritans or political moralists, Barbara Villiers became the symbol of everything wrong with the Restoration. A monarchy no longer sacred, but sensual. Not divine, but decadent. But if she was hated, she was also feared, and that gave her leverage. She moved through court with a kind of casual violence, socially speaking. She fought with ministers, threatened rivals, demanded titles for her children, and she got them. The Dukes of Cleveland and Southampton, both her sons by Charles, received wealth and prestige, despite their illegitimacy. Barbara had created a shadow dynasty, and she knew it. What makes Barbara's story particularly unsettling isn't just her influence, but the way it was normalized. Ministers negotiated with her. Foreign ambassadors courted her favor. Her bedchamber became a semi-official channel of diplomacy. She was not hidden. She was central. Even Charles, who eventually tired of her dramatics, never truly cut her off. Their relationship cooled in the 1670s, especially as new mistresses arrived, but Barbara retained her titles, her income, and her access. She converted to Catholicism in her later years, possibly out of conviction, possibly out of calculation. Either way, it added a new layer of tension to her public image, especially in a country increasingly nervous about Catholic influence. By the time she finally faded from court life, her legacy was sealed. She wasn't just one of Charles's mistresses, she was the mistress, the model, the warning, the punchline and the footnote and the thesis all in one. Modern historians still argue over her. Was she a proto-feminist, using the tools available to women in a patriarchal system to carve out real agency? Or was she simply an opportunist, using beauty and rage to enrich herself at the expense of national dignity? The answer, as always, is more complicated. What's clear is that Barbara Villiers wasn't the exception to Restoration scandal. She was its template. She showed that mistresses could be more than decoration. They could be players. They could be feared. And in doing so, she cracked the illusion that royal sexuality was private or politically neutral. She also reminded England that the personal could be very, very political. Because when Barbara whispered in the king's ear, policies changed. And when the next king took the throne, Charles's younger brother James, he would discover that scandals don't always explode. Sometimes they inherit. And when your mistress is a Churchill and your enemies call your children pretenders, the scandal isn't just about who you love. It's about what you leave behind. 19. James II, King of England, and 7 of Scotland. If Charles II turned the English court into a theater of indulgence, his younger brother James II brought the curtain crashing down with the clumsy weight of conviction. Where Charles laughed, James lectured. Where Charles seduced, James demanded obedience. And where Charles allowed scandal to swirl like perfume, James tried to extinguish it with fire and ended up choking on the smoke. But here's the uncomfortable truth. For all of James's rigid morality and religious zeal, he, too, left behind a legacy of sexual scandal. The difference? He lacked the charisma to make it palatable. James was never meant to be a popular king. He was serious, stubborn, and increasingly obsessed with restoring Catholicism in a country that had, for over a century, built its political identity on not being Catholic. But before he was crowned king in 1685, he was a younger brother with a title, a reputation, and a mistress. Her name was Arabella Churchill, not to be confused with her much more famous niece Sarah, who would go on to shape the next royal generation. Arabella was a lady-in-waiting at court, and by most accounts, neither especially beautiful nor particularly influential on her own. But James, then the Duke of York, took a liking to her, and soon enough she was his long-term mistress. Their relationship produced 4 illegitimate children, the most notable being James Fitzjames, later the Duke of Berwick, who would go on to serve as a celebrated military leader on the continent. Unlike Charles II, who flaunted his bastards with pride and made them useful, James handled his illegitimate family with a colder, more strategic hand. He provided for them, yes, but there was always a tension. He acknowledged their existence, but rarely their implications. And yet, in the eyes of the court, James's affair with Arabella wasn't scandalous because of the affair itself. It was scandalous because it contradicted everything he pretended to be. James presented himself as a man of principle, a moral reformer, a king-in-waiting who would correct the laxity of his brother's reign. He converted publicly to Catholicism in the 1670s, alarming Parliament and igniting fears of a return to papist tyranny. He became the figurehead of moral austerity, pious, disciplined, authoritarian. But there, in his shadow, was Arabella Churchill, and not just her, but the evidence of their long and fruitful relationship. This wasn't a momentary lapse or a court flirtation. It was sustained intimacy, carried on while James was married, while he was navigating complex religious alliances, while he was positioning himself as the embodiment of divine right kingship. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. A man who insisted England must return to Rome couldn't quite manage to return to his own marital bed. Still, the political establishment tolerated it. After all, Charles was still king. The Restoration Court had seen worse, and as long as James's private life didn't interfere with public order, it could be overlooked. Then, James became king. When he took the throne in 1685, the entire kingdom held its breath. Charles had at least pretended to walk the Protestant line in public. James did not. His Catholicism wasn't just personal, it was structural. He appointed Catholics to high offices. He promoted Jesuit priests. He issued declarations of indulgence that effectively suspended penal laws against Catholics and dissenting Protestants. In his mind, this was justice. In the minds of Parliament and the Anglican elite, it was treason dressed in theology. And then came the birth of a son. In 1688, James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy boy, James Francis Edward Stuart. On paper, this was cause for celebration, a male heir, a line secured. But in practice, it detonated the last ounce of Protestant tolerance left in England. Because a Catholic king with no Protestant heir could be tolerated. A Catholic king with a Protestant daughter, Mary, married to William of Orange, could be worked around. But a Catholic king with a Catholic son? That was a dynasty. Rumors exploded. The most persistent claimed the child was not Mary's at all, that the real baby had died or never existed, and that a replacement had been smuggled into the Queen's birthing chamber in a warming pan. It's ridiculous. It's also exactly the kind of rumor that survives because it's emotionally useful. People wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, because the alternative, a legitimate Catholic heir, was more frightening than fraud. And here's where James's past scandal came back to haunt him. Arabella Churchill had produced sons. James had acknowledged them. His Protestant illegitimate children, like the Duke of Berwick, were living proof that he could father boys, that he had already created potential heirs outside the royal marriage. The same behavior that had once made him human now made him suspect. If he could admit to fathering children out of wedlock, could he be trusted to tell the truth about this one? The question didn't need an answer. It just needed momentum. In late 1688, William of Orange invaded England. James's support evaporated. His Protestant officers defected. Even his own daughter, Mary, supported the invasion. James fled to France, was briefly captured, and then fled again. Parliament declared the throne vacant, and the glorious revolution began. He died in exile, a relic of absolutism, remembered not as a tragic figure, but as a warning. A king too rigid to bend, too proud to listen, and too reckless in his contradictions. James II's scandal wasn't just in his mistress, or even in his piety. It was in the collision between his private contradictions and his public convictions. He preached discipline while indulging desire. He claimed divine authority while undermining national consensus. And in the end, it wasn't adultery or religion that undid him. It was the loss of trust. Because after James, England no longer wanted divine right kings. They wanted control. And when the next king arrived, cold, calculated, and quietly surrounded by men of his own, they would learn that rumors don't need heat, just a little smoke. 20. William III, King of England, and stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. William III wasn't seductive. He was strategic. He didn't dazzle a room, he outmaneuvered it. In an era defined by theatrical kings and their larger-than-life mistresses, William entered the English monarchy like a fog rolling in over the channel. Cold, quiet, and absolutely unwilling to play by the rules of courtly charisma. He was the man who became king not by inheritance, but by invitation, with troops behind him and his wife, Mary, in front of him. When he took the throne in 1689, it wasn't just a political coup. It was a public contract. He was Protestant. He was male. He was not James II. That was enough to get him the crown. But if England had imagined a clean, morally upright Protestant monarch, they were in for a far more ambiguous story. Because William brought with him not only Dutch efficiency and anti-Catholic fervor, but also a court filled with speculation, whispers, and one particular companion who would shape his image for decades to come, Hans Willem Bentinck. From the outside, the bond between William and Bentinck appeared unremarkable. They had grown up together in the Dutch court. Bentinck had served loyally as William's chamberlain and later as his most trusted advisor. He was at William's side through illness, war, political exile, and eventual ascension to the English throne. When William became king, Bentinck was made the Earl of Portland and granted lands, titles, and influence that far exceeded what most courtiers, especially English ones, found tolerable. So far, so typical. Kings had favorites. Charles II had Barbara Villiers. James I had George Villiers. Monarchs surrounding themselves with confidants was nothing new. But there was something about Bentinck's presence. His total access to William, the personal tone of their correspondence, the ease with which he bypassed English advisors, that unsettled people. Letters between the two men, though heavily formalized by today's standards, suggested a kind of emotional dependence that invited interpretation. William once wrote to Bentinck during an illness, "I can do nothing without you." Another letter from earlier in their friendship carried a familiar, if vague, warmth that critics and political rivals would later point to with suspicion. But the real problem wasn't the content of their letters. It was the context. England had just dethroned a king partly because of fears about unnatural influence. James II had Catholic mistresses. His heirs were accused of being illegitimate. His policies were viewed through the lens of private relationships. Now, here was another monarch, foreign-born, reserved to the point of frostbite, who was already drawing accusations of favoritism and covert agendas. Bentinck, despite being a Protestant and a seasoned diplomat, was seen as a foreigner, a schemer, and more dangerously, someone whose influence could not be accounted for by policy alone. In the xenophobic, Protestant-charged atmosphere of late 17th century England, being Dutch was bad enough. Being intimately close to the king, emotionally, politically, and perhaps something more, was unacceptable. Satirical pamphlets began to circulate. These weren't noble critiques of foreign policy or parliamentary overreach. They were filled with barbs, innuendo, and not-so-subtle implications about the nature of William's attachment to Bentinck, and later to another favorite, Arnold van Keppel, the Earl of Albemarle. Keppel was younger, less experienced, and, unfortunately for William, much more visible. If Bentinck had operated behind the curtain, Keppel was placed squarely in the spotlight. His rise was even more dramatic. Within a few years of entering the king's service, he had secured a title, estates, and enormous wealth. He accompanied William on military campaigns, had direct access to the king's private chambers, and reportedly received gifts that left even the most loyal courtiers blinking in disbelief. When Bentinck began to fall out of favor, he was replaced not by an elder statesman or military hero, but by this fresh-faced Dutch courtier whose presence ignited every whisper William had hoped to bury. By now, the pattern was undeniable. William's favorites weren't English. They were young, male, and seemingly indispensable. The accusations of unnatural affections became more than court gossip. They became political weapons. The irony, of course, is that none of these relationships were ever proven to be romantic or sexual in nature. Modern historians tread carefully. There is no smoking gun. There are no explicit admissions. Only letters of fondness, acts of favoritism, and a pattern that, in a court already primed for scandal, needed no further detail to erupt into controversy. But regardless of the truth, the impact was real. William's perceived favoritism undermined his authority with the English elite. Parliament grew suspicious. His military decisions were second-guessed. The notion that he was being swayed by foreign-born companions turned domestic disagreement into national paranoia. Even his image as the great Protestant savior, cemented by the Glorious Revolution, began to fray. He had rescued England from popery, yes. But had he simply replaced one form of foreign influence with another? Had he traded a Catholic queen for Dutch courtiers with their own agendas? And through it all, William said little. He was not a man who explained himself. He did not indulge the court with charming banter or public affection. He was cold, logical, and deeply committed to governance, especially military affairs. But as the rumors swirled, even his victories began to feel compromised. Was that promotion earned, or whispered into existence by a favored ear? When William died in 1702, unmarried, childless, and surrounded not by English nobility but his Dutch inner circle, the question of his private life remained unanswered and possibly unanswerable. But the damage was done. His reign had begun as a triumph of Protestant deliverance. It ended as a case study in how silence, favoritism, and too many letters to the same man can become a scandal of their own. And as England moved forward, determined to stabilize the monarchy under yet another royal woman, the lesson was clear. Kings may be judged for their lovers. Queens, though, they're judged for their friends, especially when those friendships turn the throne into a rumor mill. And when the rumors are between women, the scandal writes itself. 21. Queen Anne. Queen Anne ruled over a kingdom that was sick of kings and exhausted by questions of who was sleeping with whom. Unfortunately for her, the court didn't take a break just because the crown finally sat on a woman's head. If anything, it got worse. With no kings to blame for court intrigue, no flamboyant mistresses to mock in verse, and no dashing favorites to assassinate in shadowy alleys, the public turned its attention to something far more uncomfortable: female friendship. Anne ruled from 1702 to 1714. That doesn't sound long, but in terms of royal headaches, it was a century packed into 12 years. She was the last monarch of the House of Stuart, the first to reign over the officially United Kingdom of Great Britain, and a woman who, despite a public image built around devotion, piety, and tragic childlessness, somehow managed to become the center of one of the most salacious scandals in early 18th century political history. And all she did, apparently, was have friends. Let's rewind. Anne's early life was defined by loss and awkwardness. She endured 18 pregnancies, 7 miscarriages, 5 stillbirths, 5 children who died young, and only one son who made it to childhood. He died at 11. That void didn't just haunt her personally, it destabilized the future of the monarchy. With no direct heir, every decision she made was loaded with dynastic anxiety. Into that atmosphere stepped Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah was not merely a courtier, she was a force of nature, sharp-tongued, politically savvy, ambitious, and endlessly quotable. She and Anne had known each other since girlhood, and their bond was intense. They wrote letters that dripped with emotion. Anne signed hers "Your poor, unfortunate, faithful Morley," and addressed Sarah as Mrs. Freeman. It was a private language full of inside jokes, melodrama, and declarations of loyalty, contemporaries noticed. And in a world where female affection was often dismissed or infantilized, the intimacy between the Queen and her Duchess was seen as unusual, suspicious, and, eventually, dangerous. Sarah wasn't just Anne's friend. She was her gatekeeper, her advisor, her mirror. She controlled access to the Queen. She influenced appointments. She shaped policy, especially through her husband John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, who was busy winning battles and collecting titles while Sarah secured his influence at home. It worked, for a time. But power corrodes friendships the same way it corrodes everything else, and Sarah's habit of speaking her mind, especially when that mind included criticism of the Queen's policies, decisions, and religious practices, slowly wore Anne down. What had once been charming grew condescending. What had once been counsel became confrontation. Enter Abigail Masham. Abigail was everything Sarah wasn't: quiet, compliant, soothing. She was also Sarah's cousin, brought into court under her patronage. At first, Sarah assumed she could control her. Instead, Abigail began to fill the space Sarah had once dominated. By the mid-1700s, Abigail had become Anne's new confidant, and suddenly, The most important political decisions in England appeared to hinge not on debates in Parliament, but on which woman sat closest to the Queen's bed. And here's where things got messy. Sarah, furious at her displacement, began to leak rumors. She accused Abigail of manipulating the Queen. She implied, sometimes directly, sometimes with maddening ambiguity, that their relationship wasn't just emotional but unnatural, that they shared a criminal intercourse, that Anne's affections had crossed a line. These weren't just petty accusations. They were political dynamite. Sarah and her allies in the Whig Party used the scandal to question Anne's judgment, her stability, her morality. In an age still obsessed with controlling female bodies and defining acceptable forms of affection, suggesting that the Queen had a sexualized relationship with a female servant wasn't just cruel. It was a constitutional crisis in innuendo form. Abigail, for her part, said very little. That was her skill. She didn't need to shout to win. She just stayed close, kept Anne calm, and slowly edged Sarah out of every position of power. The irony? We have no definitive evidence that Anne's relationships with either woman were anything beyond intense emotional bonds shaped by trauma, power, and isolation. But the standards of the time didn't care. A queen without a husband, without children, and with a fondness for female companionship? The implication filled the void, and the public loved it. Satirical pamphlets, gossipy plays, venomous broadsheets, all fed on the idea that the Queen's bedchamber was now the royal council chamber, that Anne was being ruled by her passions, that Britain's governance was in the hands of two whispering women who signed their letters with pet names and plotted in private. Sarah didn't help her own case. Her memoirs, written later, drip with bitterness. She insisted she was the real friend, the real patriot, that Abigail had stolen her place by flattery and dark arts. She never quite said what everyone else was whispering, but she didn't need to. The story had already taken hold. Queen Anne's reign, which saw the rise of party politics, the Act of Union, and the foundation of a modern Britain, became remembered by many for a feud between women in a palace. That's the tragedy. That's the scandal. Not what Anne did, but what people wanted to believe she did. Her story became a template for how female authority would be undermined for the next century. Every powerful woman who followed, especially those without a husband, would face the same whisper campaign. Was she too close to her favorite? Was she emotionally dependent? Could she be trusted? And all of it started here. Anne died in 1714, exhausted, widowed, childless, and still misunderstood. She was not flamboyant, she was not seductive. She was, if anything, deeply private. But that privacy allowed the court to project whatever fantasy or fear they needed. And so, when her successor arrived from Hanover, they made sure his scandals weren't whispered. They were shouted, public, marital, and locked in a palace that no one wanted to visit. 22. George I, King of Great Britain. George I never wanted to be King of England, and England, for its part, never really wanted George. Their relationship began the way most great dynastic arrangements do, with indifference, distrust, and an awkward treaty. He was plucked from Hanover, deposited onto a throne across the sea, and told he now ruled a country whose language he barely spoke and whose culture he barely acknowledged. But George had one redeeming quality in the eyes of the British political elite. He was Protestant. That was enough. After the death of Queen Anne in 1714, Parliament needed a monarch who would not accidentally invite the Pope to tea. George, as a distant cousin through the Stuart bloodline and a devout Lutheran with no Catholic leanings whatsoever, fit the bill. Never mind that he was humorless, stubborn, and carried himself like a minor military officer whose promotion had been a clerical error. He was the Protestant antidote to the threat of a Jacobite restoration. What England didn't expect, or perhaps tried very hard not to think about, was that their new king came preloaded with his own domestic scandal. Enter Sophia Dorothea of Celli, George's wife, and, depending on which version of the story you believe, his greatest mistake, his cruelest act, or simply the most inconvenient woman in Europe. Their marriage had been arranged, as most royal marriages were, without sentiment and with plenty of mutual disdain. George was cold and calculated. Sophia Dorothea was lively, well-liked, and unfortunately inclined to speak her mind. Their incompatibility turned quickly into open hostility, and by the time George became Elector of Hanover, the two were barely on speaking terms, except when arguing about money, parenting, or her alleged affairs. The scandal broke in the late 1690s. Sophia Dorothea was accused of conducting a long-standing affair with a Swedish count, Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. He was young, dashing, and apparently unaware that stepping between a royal couple, even one held together by resentment and duty, was a career-ending move. In 1694, Königsmarck disappeared, vanished. No trial, no duel, just gone. Contemporary accounts were swift and dramatic. Some said he was murdered and his body thrown into a river. Others claimed he was buried beneath the palace floorboards. Officially, nothing was confirmed. Unofficially, everyone understood what had happened. George, or more likely his father, had removed the problem with brutal efficiency. Sophia Dorothea, now publicly disgraced and politically radioactive, was imprisoned in a remote castle in Alden. She remained there for the rest of her life, 30 years in isolation, forbidden to see her children, forbidden to remarry, forbidden to leave. Her crime was adultery, or perhaps it was simply being inconvenient. When George ascended to the British throne in 1714, Sophia Dorothea was still alive, still locked away, and now she was Queen of England, in theory. In practice, she was erased. George never brought her to England, never acknowledged her in public, never allowed her name to be mentioned at court. She was a ghost consort, haunting the back corridors of royal gossip, her very existence a quiet embarrassment. It was a new kind of royal scandal. Not a flirtation, not a visible mistress, not an illegitimate child, but a wife officially disappeared. English courtiers whispered. Was it true she had an affair? Had George really orchestrated a murder? Why did a king arrive in Britain without a queen? Why did no one speak her name? Into that vacuum of information, speculation poured. George took multiple mistresses, none particularly subtle, and surrounded himself with a small German-speaking court. His public image, already hampered by language barriers and his stiff demeanor, became inseparable from the perception that he had wronged his wife and replaced her with foreign paramours. One mistress in particular, Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg, was given titles, lands, and royal pensions. She was referred to, with some derision, as the uncrowned queen. Her influence was undeniable, her position secure, and in contrast to Sophia Dorothea, hidden, silenced, and punished, Melusine's presence raised uncomfortable questions. Was this monarchy really so different from the immoral Stuart court it claimed to replace? The Whigs, eager to maintain their power under George, worked hard to manage the scandal. They framed the king as a stoic, lawful ruler correcting the emotional excesses of his predecessors. Sophia Dorothea, when mentioned at all, was painted as unfaithful, irrational, or dangerous to the state. The narrative was clear. She deserved what she got. He had done what he must. But the public wasn't always convinced. Pamphlets circulated that questioned the king's morality. Satirical prints depicted the king as ruled by his mistresses. Street songs, always ahead of the newspapers, mocked the vanished queen and the fat German women who had taken her place. And underneath it all, a larger fear lingered. If a queen could be locked away and forgotten, what did that say about the power of the monarchy? What did it say about the women who married into it? About the price of speaking up or stepping out of line? George. I ruled for 13 years. He was never beloved. He died in Hanover, fittingly, on a journey back to the country he had never emotionally left. Sophia Dorothea died 2 months later, still in confinement, having not seen her children, or sunlight beyond castle walls, in decades. The scandal of George Thursters wasn't fiery. It wasn't wrapped in romantic tragedy or gilded intrigue. It was cold, bureaucratic, papered over by titles, treaties, and silence. But it revealed a truth far more chilling than any court affair, that sometimes the greatest royal scandals aren't about what's done in public, but what's allowed to disappear in private. And when his son took the throne, fiery, flamboyant, and constitutionally incompatible with secrecy, the scandal would return to the streets, not as a rumor, but as a trial. 23. Sophia Dorothea of Celle. Before she became the Phantom Queen of Britain, Sophia Dorothea of Celle was something else entirely. A royal pawn, a teenage bride, a political inconvenience, and ultimately, the most forgotten woman to ever technically hold the title, Queen of England. She was not crowned, she was not celebrated, she was not mourned by her court when she died. Yet her life, stripped of all the theater that royalty usually demands, is one of the most quietly disturbing chapters in the long list of royal scandals. Because Sophia Dorothea's great sin wasn't treason, it wasn't sabotage, it wasn't seduction, it was wanting to leave. She was born in 1666, the only child of George William of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and from the very beginning, her existence was politically awkward. Her parents' marriage had been controversial. Her mother, Éléonore d'Amiens d'Olbreuse, was a French Huguenot noblewoman. Of noble blood, yes, but far below what was expected for a German prince. George William had originally refused to marry Éléonore properly, making Sophia Dorothea technically illegitimate at birth. That status was corrected later with a marriage, but the stain remained. Still, she was rich, well-educated, and by all accounts lively and attractive. That made her useful. And in the chessboard of dynastic politics, useful women don't get to choose where they're placed. She was married off at the age of 16 to her first cousin, George Louis of Hanover, later George I of Britain. It was a bad idea on paper and an even worse idea in practice. George was stiff, formal, and utterly uninterested in charm. Sophia Dorothea, meanwhile, was spirited, outspoken, and unprepared for the claustrophobic world of German court politics. They loathed each other almost immediately. He called her vain and foolish. She called him cold and cruel. Unfortunately for both of them, duty demanded offspring. So, like many royal couples before them, they did what they were told and produced 2 children, a son, George Augustus, later George II, and a daughter, Sophia Dorothea of Hanover. Then they more or less parted ways, emotionally, if not legally. It didn't help that George Louis carried on an open affair with his mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg, who would later follow him to England and be given the kind of wealth and titles that Sophia Dorothea was never allowed to enjoy. Melusine was everything Sophia wasn't: quiet, loyal, and willing to play the long game. George valued that. He saw Sophia's frustration and outspokenness not as evidence of passion or independence, but as disorder, disrespect, a threat to the quiet dignity he imagined for his court. Sophia Dorothea, trapped in this lonely, loveless marriage, sought comfort elsewhere. Whether her relationship with Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck was emotional, romantic, or something more remains uncertain. What we do know is that their correspondence, some of which survives, was deeply affectionate. They dreamed of escape, of leaving court behind, of starting over somewhere else. This, of course, was unacceptable. In 1694, Königsmarck disappeared. Just disappeared. One evening, he went into the Leinenschloss, the Hanoverian palace, and was never seen again. No trial, no body, just a convenient silence. Whispers filled the court. Guards claimed to hear strange noises. Some suggested he'd been killed and buried beneath the palace floor. Others said he'd been smuggled away and murdered in the forest. No one really believed he had simply vanished. But no one investigated either. George Louis, by now obsessed with removing Sophia Dorothea from his life permanently, used the incident as justification for a formal separation. She was stripped of her title, banished from court, forbidden from seeing her children. And then, in what might be the coldest move in British royal history, she was confined to the castle of Alden, not imprisoned officially, just never allowed to leave. She would remain there for the rest of her life, 30 years. Not one visit from her son, not one public acknowledgement of her status, not even a proper mention during George's eventual coronation as King of Great Britain in 1714. She became the queen who wasn't. When George moved to England, he left her behind without hesitation. She was an inconvenience to his new image, a monarch trying to project Protestant strength, dynastic stability, and moral restraint. Sophia Dorothea, with her emotional history, her alleged affair, and her decades of isolation, didn't fit. Better to forget her. But England didn't forget, or rather, England couldn't help but speculate. Who was this queen they never saw? What had she done to deserve erasure? And why exactly was her husband so determined to keep her out of sight? Pamphlets did what pamphlets do best, speculated wildly. Some portrayed her as a tragic heroine trapped by a cruel and loveless marriage. Others cast her as a manipulative adulteress, the kind of woman whose very existence threatened the sanctity of monarchy. A few more imaginative writers even linked her story to the broader Jacobite cause, arguing that a king who could lock up his wife could just as easily betray the Protestant constitution. In the end, Sophia Dorothea died in 1726, still confined in Alden Castle. Her body was buried without fanfare. George, still reigning in Britain, did not mourn publicly. He died a year later, on a trip to Hanover, never having mentioned her again. There were no paintings of her in British palaces. No portraits displayed at court. Her name was not celebrated, nor cursed. It was erased. But her silence is the scandal. Because Sophia Dorothea's story is not about infidelity. It's not about ambition. It's about what happens when a royal woman tries to leave, and the system cannot let her go. She wasn't deposed. She wasn't exiled in luxury. She wasn't given a quiet retirement. She was buried alive in her own story. And when her son took the throne as George II, a little older, a little sharper, and a lot more flamboyant, the scandal would no longer be confined to castle walls. It would take the form of tabloid wars, backroom hearings, royal trials, and a marriage so broken, even Parliament had to get involved. 24. George IV, King of the United Kingdom. By the time George IV officially became king in 1820, the British monarchy was no longer sacred. It was content, and he was the headline. If his father, George III, had symbolized duty and moral authority, whether or not he always embodied it, George IV was something else entirely, a full-blown royal spectacle in human form. His life wasn't a chapter in royal history. It was a serialized scandal, reprinted daily, eagerly consumed by a public that had stopped respecting the crown and started laughing at it. And laugh they did. At his debts, his fashion, his waistline, his wild nights, his even wilder friends, and above all, his personal life, which made his predecessor's dalliances seem almost quaint by comparison. The trouble really began while he was still Prince of Wales, a title he carried for nearly 60 years, more than enough time to cause generations of headaches. From the moment he came of age, George Augustus Frederick was a walking contradiction, obsessed with appearances, incapable of discipline, desperate for approval, but incapable of earning it honestly. His extravagance was legendary. So was his loneliness. He sought affection where he could buy it, and power wherever he could charm it. Unfortunately for him, charm has a half-life, and his burned out quickly. At the heart of George's scandalous reputation was a relationship that was, by every legal and constitutional metric, a nightmare. His secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. Maria was everything George wasn't. She was older, she was Catholic, she was twice widowed, and crucially, She was absolutely the wrong woman for a man in line to inherit a Protestant throne. But that didn't stop him. In 1785, George, then 23 and already neck-deep in debts, fell for Maria and secretly married her in a private ceremony. It was romantic. It was illegal. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required the king's permission for any descendant to marry, and George III had made it abundantly clear. A Catholic bride was out of the question. So the marriage was kept secret, technically invalid, but emotionally real. George considered her his true wife for years, calling her my only true love, long after they had separated. He even wore a miniature of her portrait in a locket around his neck, hidden under his overdone cravats and silk waistcoats. But emotion doesn't pay debts, and by the early 1790s, George's financial situation was catastrophic. Parliament had already bailed him out multiple times, and now they made the terms clear. No more money unless he agreed to a politically acceptable marriage. Enter Princess Caroline of Brunswick. Caroline was German nobility, George's cousin, of course, because nothing says royal logic like marrying within the family tree. She was loud, impulsive, and according to George, unwashed. He took one look at her and reportedly asked for a stiff drink. She allegedly asked if he was always this drunk. It was love at first revulsion. Still, they married in 1795. By the next morning, George claimed he was already seeking an exit. The union produced one child, Princess Charlotte, and nothing else. No companionship, no reconciliation, no forgiveness. The prince returned to Maria Fitzherbert. Caroline returned to gossip columns. For the next 2 decades, George and Caroline conducted a marital Cold War that slowly escalated into a national spectacle. George denied her access to court. Caroline embarrassed him by refusing to disappear. She traveled through Europe, collecting allies, rumors, and a reputation for eccentric behavior that may or may not have included inappropriate relationships with various men in her orbit. By the time George III died and George IV ascended the throne, the public was ready to choose sides. George, bloated and petulant, demanded that Caroline be stripped of the title Queen. Caroline, theatrical and defiant, sailed back to England to claim her place as Queen Consort, creating one of the most bizarre public dramas in British history. George's solution was spectacularly bad, the 1820 Pains and Penalties Bill. The bill was essentially a public trial masquerading as legislation. It accused Caroline of adultery and aimed to strip her of her titles and annul her marriage. Parliament became a courtroom. Witnesses were called, dirty laundry aired, satirical prints flooded the streets. The trial was lurid, humiliating, and politically disastrous. The public naturally sided with Caroline. After all, George was already a figure of ridicule, known for his lavish spending, rumored affairs, and general self-importance. Caroline, in contrast, positioned herself as the wronged woman. The wife denied her rightful place, the mother of the people's princess, Charlotte, who had tragically died young. Her return to England became a political movement. Petitions were signed. Riots broke out. Effigies were burned, not of Caroline, but of George. The monarchy had never looked weaker. Eventually, the bill was withdrawn. The government, sensing that the tide had turned, let it die quietly. Caroline was never crowned queen, but she wasn't erased either. She remained a thorn in George's side until her death in 1821, just weeks after she was turned away from Westminster Abbey during his coronation. The symbolism wrote itself. George ruled until 1830, largely from behind velvet curtains, obsessed with ceremony and image, but increasingly irrelevant. His health failed. His popularity never recovered. And his reign left behind no legitimate heirs and no illusions. The scandal of George IV wasn't a single affair or a forbidden love. It was a lifetime of reckless choices, personal pettiness, and public theater. His story revealed how monarchy could transform from sacred institution into tabloid drama. He didn't just break the rules. He blurred the lines between ruler and celebrity, between privacy and performance, between power and spectacle. And when he died, the monarchy didn't just need an heir. It needed a public relations miracle. Unfortunately, the next royal woman in line had a scandal of her own, and hers came with witnesses, Parliament, and an entire nation watching with popcorn in hand. 25. Caroline of Brunswick, Queen Consort. Caroline of Brunswick was never supposed to be the main character in British politics. She was written in as a supporting actress, a dynastic solution to a constitutional problem. But she had a nasty habit of stealing the scene, and by the time she died in 1821, she had managed to do the impossible, become both a national heroine and a royal embarrassment, depending on who was paying for the newspaper. Her marriage was doomed before it began. Caroline was handpicked to marry George, the then Prince of Wales, for all the wrong reasons. She was Protestant, royal enough, and, most importantly, came with a dowry. George, perpetually in debt and perpetually avoiding accountability, needed money. Parliament offered it on the condition that he marry someone respectable. Caroline ticked enough boxes to qualify. The match was arranged with all the enthusiasm of a peace treaty between two mildly hostile grocery chains. Their first meeting was, by every surviving account, a disaster. George found her clumsy, loud, and unkempt. Caroline found him drunk, dismissive, and already in love, with himself and with his longtime mistress, Maria Fitzherbert. The wedding went ahead anyway. The marriage, however, barely got off the ground. Within weeks, George had returned to Fitzherbert. Caroline was effectively exiled within her own household, given a stipend, a title, and just enough distance from her husband to avoid open conflict. But she was still the Princess of Wales. She was still the mother of his only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, and she wasn't going anywhere. The couple's mutual disdain quickly became public knowledge. The prince refused to live with Caroline. Caroline, for her part, refused to disappear quietly. She cultivated her own court, welcomed visitors, and began traveling across the country, earning sympathy from those who saw her as an underdog queen-in-waiting, unfairly cast aside. In a monarchy still, clinging to the illusion of family harmony, this was pure dynamite. Things only got worse after the death of Princess Charlotte in 1817. Charlotte had been the one unifying figure in the royal family, beloved by the public, seen as the hope for a new generation, and, crucially, the only legitimate grandchild of George III. Her sudden death at the age of 21 left a vacuum, not just in the line of succession, but in the public's emotional investment in the monarchy. And into that vacuum stepped Caroline, or more accurately, she was shoved. With Charlotte gone, Caroline had nothing left to lose. She left England in 1814 under pressure and increasingly invasive scrutiny, but she wasn't content to fade into the background. While traveling across Europe, Naples, Sicily, the Ottoman Empire, she gathered not just friends, but scandal. Rumors followed her like cigarette smoke. There were whispers of impropriety, of strange men in her entourage, of servants becoming suspiciously wealthy. One name in particular, Bartolomeo Pergami, her Italian chamberlain, became the centerpiece of the gossip. Their relationship, whatever it was, formed the basis for what would later be the most absurd quasi-trial in British royal history. When George III died in 1820 and George IV finally ascended the throne, Caroline saw her chance. She returned to England, demanding recognition as Queen Consort. George, predictably, exploded. He refused to allow her to be crowned. He refused to allow her into court. And, most spectacularly, he introduced the Pains and Penalties Bill, a parliamentary attempt to legally annul the marriage on the grounds of adultery and strip Caroline of her titles. The bill was a disaster. It was meant to humiliate Caroline into backing down. Instead, it turned her into a martyr. The hearings dragged on for months. Witnesses were called to describe Caroline's alleged misconduct in minute, often ridiculous detail. Tabloid prints and broadsheets had a field day. Political satirists portrayed George as bloated, immoral, and paranoid. Caroline was recast as the wronged wife, the people's queen, the survivor of male cruelty. Crowds gathered outside Parliament. Petitions poured in. Riots erupted in support of Caroline. The monarchy had not just stumbled into scandal, it had become the scandal. The bill passed narrowly in the House of Lords, but the government, seeing the writing on the wall, dropped it before it could reach the Commons. Caroline technically lost the trial, but she had won the war for public sympathy. George was humiliated. His coronation plans became damage control, and Caroline, never one to miss an opportunity for spectacle, tried to attend the coronation. On July 19, 1821, she arrived at Westminster Abbey in full regalia, attempting to enter through several doors. Each was barred. Guards turned her away. She was told her name was not on the list. This, of course, was the final insult, and also the most metaphorically perfect moment in her life. The woman who had been married for politics, exiled for convenience, tried in Parliament for scandal, and adored by the people was denied entry to the very event that would have cemented her public status. She died just a few weeks later, aged 53, likely from complications brought on by stress and illness. Her final wish was to have the words, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England," engraved on her coffin. Her life is often remembered as a sideshow to George IV's spectacular decline, but in many ways, she was the more modern figure, a woman who used public image, populist sympathy, and a very real sense of injustice to challenge a monarchy built on silencing its own problems. And even in death, she left behind a question that still haunts royal marriages. What happens when the crown can't control the narrative? Because up next came a man who understood image better than anyone, a king who made scandal look fashionable and whose social circle blurred the line between royalty and indulgence. 26. William IV, King of the United Kingdom. Before he was king, William IV had already lived the kind of life that might have been considered scandalous, if it hadn't also been so strangely endearing. Known informally as the Sailor King, William spent most of his life floating just outside the main currents of royal responsibility, bobbing between naval postings, bad habits, and an unusually long domestic arrangement with a woman who was never supposed to matter, and yet did. He wasn't destined for the throne, not even close. Born in 1765 as the third son of George III, William was given a naval education and packed off to sea at the age of 13, where, unlike many royals, he actually served. Not symbolically, he got seasick, took orders, and occasionally got into bar brawls with fellow sailors. It gave him a coarser, more populist reputation than his brothers. He drank. He swore. He didn't much care for high ceremony. That suited the Navy just fine. It didn't suit the monarchy at all. For decades, William was treated as a sort of royal afterthought. His older brothers, first the doomed Prince Frederick, then the increasingly unlikable George IV, held the spotlight. William was left to his own devices, and those devices were not subtle. Enter Dorothea Jordan. Dorothea was an Irish actress, known for her wit, her stage presence, and her willingness to live unconventionally. She and William met in the 1790s and began what would become one of the most openly domestic, long-running, and complicated relationships in royal history. For 20 years, they lived together in what was, for all practical purposes, a common-law marriage. They had 10 children, yes, 10, who were all given the surname Fitzclarence, a not-so-subtle code for royal illegitimacy. What made this arrangement remarkable wasn't the affair itself. Many royals had mistresses. It was the public nature of their domestic life. William doted on Dorothea. He attended her plays, defended her reputation, and treated her as a de facto wife in everything but legality. Their home at Bushy House functioned as a kind of alternative royal household, complete with picnics, pets, and the kind of casual intimacy that the actual royal court couldn't fake if it tried. But this wasn't a fairy tale. The cracks were always there. As William aged, and especially as his older brother George IV's reign became a national embarrassment, The idea that William might one day become king started to feel less absurd. Suddenly, his household arrangement became a liability. A respectable monarchy couldn't afford a king with an actress partner and a dozen unofficial heirs. The solution, of course, was marriage. In 1811, William separated from Dorothea. She was given a pension and expected to disappear gracefully. She didn't. She tried to continue working, but found herself in mounting debt. She died alone in 1816, her final years marked by quiet struggle. William, for all his affection, had done what duty required, traded companionship for credibility. In 1818, he married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a union that was everything his previous relationship wasn't: official, respectable, and almost completely devoid of passion. But it worked politically. Adelaide was pious, charitable, and loyal. She helped repair William's image in the press, and while their attempts to produce a legitimate heir were tragically unsuccessful, all their children died in infancy, their public role as a sober, devoted couple gave the monarchy a much-needed breath of fresh air after the drama of George IV. When William finally became king in 1830, he was already 64. Nobody expected much. But in many ways, his reign was surprisingly steady. He lacked polish. He once arrived late to a diplomatic dinner and told the stunned ambassadors that he'd been taking a nap. He hated court ritual. He despised wigs. He preferred to walk around his palace in slippers. But he understood something few kings did: the value of being normal. Which brings us back to scandal, not in the form of sudden disgrace, but in the slow-burning tension between private life and public image. William's relationship with Dorothea and their children didn't just go away. The Fitzclarences remained a visible, occasionally awkward presence in British society. William gave them titles, marriages, and pensions. He tried to secure positions for them. He treated them like real children, even though the law never would. This blurred the line between royal legitimacy and royal favoritism. The public, by then deeply cynical after the excesses of George IV, mostly tolerated it. Some even found it refreshing: a king who acknowledged his mistakes and cared about his family, even the unofficial parts. But not everyone was amused. Parliament bristled at the idea of royal funds being used to support so many half-royal offspring. Evangelical moralists condemned William's past openly, and beneath it all was a quiet constitutional anxiety. If the monarchy couldn't uphold a standard of moral respectability, what exactly was it for? William's legacy, ironically, would be his ordinariness. He wasn't beloved, but he wasn't hated. He didn't scandalize the papers the way his brother had, but he never quite cleaned up the mess either. His past, his children, his partner, his debts followed him like a shadow trailing the throne. He died in 1837, aged 71, with no surviving legitimate heirs. His niece Victoria would ascend the throne, ushering in a new era of tightly controlled royal image-making. No more visible mistresses. No more messy, unofficial children. The monarchy had learned its lesson. But before Victoria could become the icon of imperial virtue, the British crown had to pass through one final figure of excess, a man whose charm masked 1,000 rumors, and whose private weekends would give the public more than enough to talk about. 27. Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom. If George IV blurred the line between monarch and tabloid subject, Edward VII came along and made it fashionable. He was the royal playboy who actually made it to the throne. By the time he was crowned in 1901, at nearly 60 years old, he had already spent 4 decades accumulating enough scandal, gossip, and velvet-upholstered drama to fill a minor library. He was the king-in-waiting who turned waiting into a lifestyle. Born in 1841 to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Edward, known as Bertie to the family, was never the ideal royal son. Where his father was disciplined, moralistic, and anxious about propriety, Bertie was bored, exuberant, and constitutionally allergic to restraint. From an early age, he was groomed to uphold the image of a morally upright British monarchy, the great Victorian invention designed to provide moral instruction to the empire. But Bertie had no intention of being a symbol. He wanted to live, and live he did. Edward's youth was an extended exercise in well-dressed rebellion. As Prince of Wales, he developed a reputation for indulgence in every form: food, clothes, conversation, and company. He was charming, disarmingly so. He could disarm a hostile room with a smile, then scandalize it with a quiet aside 5 minutes later. His wit was effortless, his appetite legendary, and his evenings long. While Queen Victoria mourned the death of Prince Albert with monastic intensity, withdrawing from public life for years, Edward filled the vacuum by becoming the face of an emerging, flashier monarchy. But not everyone approved. Victoria saw her son's behavior as a personal failure. She blamed him, in part, for Albert's death, believing that Bertie's youthful indiscretions had hastened his father's decline. The tension between mother and son became not just personal, it became public. That was the backdrop for what historians now call the Marlborough House set, a high society circle orbiting Edward that came to define the tone of upper-class British life in the late 19th century. This group, composed of aristocrats, actors, politicians, and fashionable hostesses, made the Prince of Wales their social sun. They dined extravagantly, partied enthusiastically, and brought a continental flair to what had previously been a staid Protestant institution. At the heart of this glittering social machine was Edward himself. Bigger than life, usually in a tailored waistcoat, and surrounded by the type of elegant mischief that made newspapers both fascinated and deeply nervous. His romantic entanglements, though discreetly managed, were hardly secrets. Edward had a soft spot for women who sparkled in salons and on stages. His mistresses were not hidden away in country estates, they were part of the royal theater. Lily Langtry, an actress with the elegance of nobility and the wit of a politician, became one of his most famous companions. Others followed: Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick; Alice Keppel, the socially shrewd grande dame who would, generations later, be remembered primarily as the great-grandmother of Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall. What distinguished Edward's romantic life from that of previous royals was the level of normalization. His affairs were known, acknowledged in knowing glances at dinner parties, joked about in coded language in the press, and even tolerated within his own marriage. Queen Alexandra, his wife, carried herself with grace and endured it all with the kind of public silence that was part admiration, part necessity. She knew the game, and she understood the stakes. Because for all his scandals, Edward also understood people. He was surprisingly good at diplomacy. He charmed foreign leaders where others might have scolded them. He navigated complicated political terrain with the same conversational ease that made him the star of so many dinner parties. When he finally became king after Victoria's death, many expected a frivolous reign. Too old, too spoiled, too unserious. Instead, they got something closer to a social statesman. But the tension never fully left. Even as king, Edward's past followed him. His name had been whispered in the corridors of court cases, most famously the Mordaunt divorce scandal, where he was called to testify about his relationship with the defendant's wife. Though never convicted of wrongdoing, the very idea that a future king might be involved in such proceedings was enough to cause political shivers. He avoided true disgrace through a mixture of timing, social leverage, and good old-fashioned royal insulation. Yet underneath the pageantry, a new kind of unease had begun to set in. The monarchy had once been sold as a moral compass. Victoria had made it synonymous with sobriety, piety, and quiet duty. Edward, by contrast, embodied a new kind of royalty: human, flawed, affable, indulgent. The public adored him, but they also scrutinized him. The newspapers couldn't stop writing about his clothes, his friends, his weekend retreats. He had turned monarchy into a kind of theater, with himself as both lead actor and subject of critique. This transformation wasn't without consequences. His reign, though brief, only 9 years, marked the end of something. The Edwardian era became a nostalgic shorthand for excess before collapse, champagne before the trenches. The world he inhabited, of endless dinners and endless affairs, would not survive the Great War. Nor would the public's tolerance for private indiscretion in high places. Edward died in 1910, still beloved by many, still gossiped about by more. His funeral drew massive crowds. His mistresses were said to have watched from balconies. His son, George V, would spend the rest of his reign quietly trying to reverse the tone his father had set, cutting expenses, trimming the guest list, and praying for less scandal. But Edward left behind more than a glamorous reputation. He left behind a question that the British monarchy has wrestled with ever since. If the crown is worn by someone too human, does it lose its mystique? And just as Edward's court blurred the line between royalty and society, one woman, perfectly dressed and perfectly positioned, would blur the line between mistress and manager, and her name would echo far beyond the velvet ropes. 28. Alice Keppel. If royal mistresses are often seen as shadows behind the throne, Alice Keppel was more like velvet wallpaper, stylish, expensive, always there, and easily underestimated by anyone who didn't understand how power really works. She wasn't the first mistress to Edward VII, and she certainly wasn't the last woman to be quietly woven into the royal tapestry without ever holding a title. But she was, without question, the most enduring. In a world that ran on hierarchy, discretion, and whispered influence, Alice Keppel figured out how to exist at the very top of society without ever being formally invited. And in doing so, she perfected a strange royal tradition: the semi-official mistress, the woman whose presence was tolerated, even necessary, but never openly admitted. Alice was born Alice Frederica Edmonstone in 1868, into the kind of minor aristocratic family that specialized in hosting dinners for more important people. She was clever, beautiful in the way that British high society liked, graceful but not threatening, and most importantly, socially fluent. She understood the difference between attention and exposure, between admiration and scandal. That subtlety would serve her well. She married Lieutenant Colonel George Keppel in 1891. He was polite, presentable, and almost entirely irrelevant to the story that followed. Alice, on the other hand, moved quickly into the upper layers of London society, aligning herself with the salons and social circles that orbited the Prince of Wales. Edward, still decades away from the throne, but already at the peak of his cultural influence. By the time Alice became his mistress around 1898, the role had already come with a well-worn script. The prince had a long-standing reputation for keeping multiple female companions, actresses, hostesses, even aristocrats, and many assumed Alice would be another short-term affair. But Alice did something very few mistresses ever managed. She made herself useful. She wasn't just there for charm. She was there to manage, to soothe, to deflect, to listen to the rants, smooth the temper, and gently nudge the king in politically useful directions. Edward, who by that point was prone to overindulgence and occasional outbursts, reportedly calmed in her presence. She became, in effect, a private secretary with a socialite's wardrobe. Unlike many of his other mistresses, Alice didn't flaunt her position. She didn't feed gossip columns or chase public acknowledgement. She existed just behind the velvet ropes, always in the room, rarely in the spotlight. And she maintained an essential rule of scandal management: never outshine the crown. Queen Alexandra, Edward's long-suffering and publicly dignified wife, tolerated Alice's presence with a cool silence. In fact, it's believed that Alexandra preferred Alice to some of Edward's earlier companions. Alice, at least, had manners. She knew how to stay on the right side of royal protocol, how to nod in the right places, and how to disappear when necessary. But it wasn't just about the prince. Alice Keppel's influence extended far beyond Edward's affections. She cultivated political relationships, acted as an informal sounding board, and even passed messages between factions. Politicians took her seriously, not because she held any official position, but because everyone knew she could whisper directly into the king's ear. In some cases, she functioned as a kind of behind-the-scenes diplomat, steering conversations, nudging decisions, and smoothing over the rough edges of Edwardian politics. It was a form of power with no official name and no legal recognition. But it worked. And it was exactly the kind of unspoken arrangement that kept the monarchy running, elegant, controlled, and plausibly deniable. Still, the public wasn't entirely blind. Edward's relationship with Alice was widely known, if not publicly acknowledged. Cartoons hinted. Columns winked. Society gossiped. But the key to Alice's success was never being caught saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. She knew the rules. She played the part. And as a result, she remained in the prince's life until the very end. When Edward died in 1910, Alice was devastated, but not dramatic. She retreated gracefully from the court, as expected. She received no title, no formal pension, no statue. Just silence. And yet, she left a legacy. Through her daughter Violet, Alice became the great-grandmother of Camilla Parker Bowles, later Queen Camilla, who would famously become entangled with another Prince of Wales, in another generation that struggled to manage its own public image. The irony didn't go unnoticed. Royal historians couldn't help but trace the lines of repetition. Another mistress, another long affair, another attempt to reconcile personal affection with public duty. In many ways, Alice Keppel set the standard. She was the blueprint for how a woman outside the system could operate within it, quietly, powerfully, and with just enough charm to make people forget how uncomfortable the situation really was. Her story doesn't come with fireworks or dramatic collapses. No trials, no scandals that brought down ministers, no exile, no diaries left behind to be quoted by tabloids a century later. Just presence, quiet influence, the art of being necessary without being obvious. And that's what makes her so fascinating. Because if Edward VII was the king of excess, Alice Keppel was the counterbalance, the poised, whispering strategist who helped the monarchy survive its own appetite. But the next chapter in the royal saga wasn't about survival. It was about danger, secrecy, and a prince whose name would be whispered in connection with one of the most explosive scandals of the entire Victorian age, whether or not he ever set foot through the door. 29. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Every royal generation has one. The heir who doesn't quite fit. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was born into the high noon of the British Empire, destined to inherit a throne that had never seemed more secure. And yet somehow from the start, everything about him felt fragile. His mind, his health, his story. And like all fragile things left in full view, he became a screen onto which everyone else projected their fears, rumors, and obsessions. Albert Victor was the eldest son of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, and grandson of Queen Victoria. Born in 1864, he was, on paper, the future. But even before he could walk, concerns quietly started to swirl. He was delicate, unremarkable in his studies. His speech was slow. His mind, some said, was soft. In private, his tutors expressed concern. In public, they expressed reassurance. Royal heirs were supposed to inspire confidence, not confusion. So a careful narrative was built around him. Polite, gentle, refined, and mostly kept out of the spotlight, which was, of course, its own kind of spotlight. Albert Victor's personal life became a matter of speculation long before he was old enough to scandalize anyone. He was shipped off to the Navy, then to Cambridge, then on a world tour. The goal was clear: keep him moving, keep him managed. And if he wasn't brilliant, at least he would be quiet. A soft-spoken monarch in training who could smile, wave, and leave the real decisions to the professionals. But something shifted in 1889. That year, London police raided a male brothel on Cleveland Street, a quiet address in Fitzrovia. What they discovered behind its modest doors sent ripples through the upper class. A clientele composed largely of elite men, including government clerks, aristocrats, and, allegedly, figures connected to the royal household. In another time, this might have been a sordid footnote. But Victorian England was deeply invested in public morality, and male same-sex relations were not only taboo, they were criminal. The fallout from the Cleveland Street scandal was swift and surreal. Names were dropped, then retracted. Witnesses disappeared. Key suspects quietly fled to the continent. The press circled, then pulled back. It was a strange, blurry dance between justice and discretion. And at the center of the smoke cloud, though never named officially, was a whisper. What about Prince Eddie? That was Albert Victor's nickname, Eddie. And while no concrete evidence ever tied him to Cleveland Street, the rumors exploded. Why? Because he fit. Not the crime, perhaps, but the myth. He was vague, isolated, easy to imagine in places he shouldn't have been, speaking to people he shouldn't have known. That ambiguity, combined with a nervous royal household desperate to contain scandal, was all the public needed. What had been a whisper turned into a cloud of innuendo that hung over his short, strange life. To be clear, there is no hard evidence placing Albert Victor at the center of Cleveland Street. Historians have scoured the police files, the redacted testimony, the correspondence between panicked ministers. What remains is smoke, never fire. But the damage was done. The scandal cemented Albert Victor's reputation as a man surrounded by mystery, weak character, and questionable friends. Every attempt to rehabilitate his public image, engagements, charity visits, carefully staged photos, only made it more obvious that the palace was worried. The rumors followed him everywhere. Even decades later, conspiracy theorists would try to link him, absurdly, to the Jack the Ripper murders. That's how durable his myth became. A soft-spoken, socially awkward royal turned into a catch-all villain for the public's deepest anxieties. In the final act of this strange, spiraling story, Albert Victor was betrothed to Princess Mary of Teck, who would eventually become Queen Mary, consort to his younger brother, George V. It was a desperate attempt to stabilize his image, a good match, a proper royal marriage, a clean slate. But he never made it to the altar. In January 1892, during a severe influenza epidemic, Albert Victor fell ill and died at the age of 28. Officially, the cause was pneumonia, but unofficially, the whispers never stopped. Some blamed a hidden illness. Others pointed to a supposed nervous breakdown. And of course, some suggested the royal family had quietly removed a problem they couldn't afford to let reach the throne. His funeral was attended with full ceremony. Queen Victoria, devastated by yet another death in her family, mourned him deeply. The public, too, grieved, but with an odd detachment, as though they had lost a figure more imagined than real. Because that was always the heart of Albert Victor's story. Not what he did, but what people thought he could have done. He never ruled. He never reigned. He left behind no letters, no speeches, no legacy of substance. Just a trail of rumors, carefully managed silences, and a space in history where a king should have been. The monarchy never officially addressed the Cleveland Street affair in relation to Albert Victor. Why would they? To deny it would be to acknowledge it. Instead, they did what they always do when things get uncomfortable. They buried it under ceremony, marble, and new headlines. And yet the scandal wasn't quite over. Because there was one more man, this time a royal household insider. A courtier, an equerry. And unlike Prince Eddie, he didn't just disappear into rumor. He boarded a train and fled the country. 30. Lord Arthur Somerset. Lord Arthur Somerset wasn't the most important man in Victorian England. He wasn't even the most scandalous man in his own family. But for a brief moment in 1889, he became the kind of figure every institution fears. A quiet insider with too many connections, too much access, and just enough bad timing to bring the whole house down. He was, by all appearances, an unimposing man. Born in 1840 to the Duke of Beaufort, Arthur Somerset was part of that strange upper crust of the British aristocracy that lived like a whisper behind the monarchy. He wasn't a political heavyweight. He wasn't a war hero. What he had was pedigree, manners, and most crucially, a place inside the royal household. He served as equerry to the Prince of Wales, Edward, the future Edward VII, which gave him both visibility and invisibility. He was always present, always nearby, and always one step behind the throne. That's what made his sudden and ignominious exit from England so deeply unsettling. To understand how Lord Arthur went from courtier to exile, we have to return, once again, to the Cleveland Street scandal. In the summer of 1889, the Metropolitan Police stumbled onto a discreet address in Fitzrovia that turned out to be a brothel operated by and for men. This wasn't just another vice raid. The clientele list, even in fragmentary form, suggested something far more combustible. Young aristocrats, military officers, government clerks, and, crucially, individuals with ties to the very top of society. At first, the investigation followed the usual script. Names collected, testimonies taken, panic politely measured. But then something unusual happened. The name Lord Arthur Somerset surfaced, repeatedly, not in public, not yet, but in internal police memoranda, whispered briefings, and closed-door conversations at Scotland Yard. He wasn't just a nobleman. He was someone inside the Prince of Wales's household, someone with keys, with knowledge, with proximity. That changed everything. It's important to note that no formal charges were ever brought against Lord Arthur Somerset. That's not an accident. It's the entire point. The machinery of discretion began humming almost immediately. Senior officials, including the Home Secretary, were informed. The Prince of Wales himself was privately made aware. Letters were written, files were edited. At least one draft arrest warrant was prepared, then quietly shelved. What followed was a strange, slow-motion unraveling. Somerset was interviewed by police. He denied everything. He also, wisely, began preparing to leave the country. In October 1889, he was granted leave from his military duties. By November, he had boarded a boat to France. By the end of the year, he was in exile. The excuse? Health. The reality? Containment. Because the scandal wasn't just about Somerset. It was about what he represented. The risk that someone so close to the monarchy could drag the entire institution into the public eye in the worst possible way. Victorian society could tolerate hypocrisy. It could tolerate secrets. What it could not tolerate was visibility, and Lord Arthur Somerset was becoming dangerously visible. The press, constrained by strict libel laws and a sense of deference that was already beginning to erode, hinted at the story without naming it. An aristocratic personage of interest, they said, a gentleman close to the court. Satirical cartoons danced around the topic. Foreign papers, less encumbered by domestic etiquette, were more blunt. Back in Britain, Parliament grumbled. Opposition politicians smelled blood, or at least the faint scent of cover-up. Why had certain witnesses vanished? Why had police files been redacted? Who had intervened and why? But as always, time was the Crown's best ally. Lord Arthur Somerset remained abroad. He lived in France for years, mostly in quiet obscurity, a faded figure of whispered disgrace. He never returned to public life in England. The monarchy, for its part, said nothing. Not once. Not officially. What made the episode so unsettling wasn't that it happened. It was how carefully it didn't happen in the official record. No trial, no testimony, no public reckoning, just a soft fade to black. but that silence did its own damage. Among the British public, especially in an era increasingly skeptical of aristocratic privilege, the scandal reinforced a sense that justice was conditional. That class still bought immunity, that the closer one stood to power, the less likely one was to be held accountable. Lord Arthur became, in a quiet way, a symbol, not of personal guilt, but of institutional evasion. And that matters, because this wasn't just about one man. It was about the delicate machinery of royal image-making. The same system that had protected Edward VII's social indulgences and buried Prince Albert Victor's unspoken questions had now closed ranks once more. But each time it did, the illusion cracked a little further. Somerset died in 1926, having never returned to England. By then, the monarchy had passed through war, revolution, and the early tremors of modern celebrity culture. But the old playbook still lingered. Deny, deflect, disappear. In many ways, his story is the most haunting of all. No riots, no trials, no dramatic downfall, just quiet disappearance. A man who knew too much, stayed too close, and was quietly erased from the photograph. And maybe that's the final irony of this long, winding list of royal entanglements. That the most dangerous scandals are not the loud ones. They're the ones that slip away in silence, leaving behind nothing but an empty chair and a locked drawer in the royal archives.